Welcome, guardian of Gotham's secrets, to a journey through the deepest shadows of the Dark Knight's world, where ancient curses echo beneath the city's foundations, and the weight of family legacies shapes destinies across generations. Tonight, we shall explore the complete chronicles of darkness that have tested the Batman, from the corrupted bloodlines that built his city to the twisted souls who challenge his mission. Let the rhythm of rain against gargoyles and the whisper of cape through midnight air carry you into peaceful slumber as we trace every thread of shadow that has woven itself into Batman's legend. Close your eyes, protector of dreams, and let these tales unfold like pages from Gotham's hidden history. In the beginning, before the spires of Wayne Tower pierced the sky, and before the shadow of the bat fell across the city's rooftops, there existed a place whose very foundations were laid in deception, whose streets were built upon bones, and whose destiny was sealed by acts of betrayal that would echo through centuries of darkness. This is the tale of Gotham's true genesis, a story buried beneath layers of official history and family mythology, where the curse that would one day give birth to both heroes and monsters was first planted in soil made fertile by blood and lies. The chronicles of this ancient evil begin not in the gleaming boardrooms of modern Gotham, but in the mist-shrouded forests of the New World in the year 1663, when two men stepped from a ship onto shores that would know no peace for 3.5 centuries hence. They came bearing crosses and carrying swords, these self-appointed soldiers of God. Yet the mission that brought them across treacherous waters was one that would test the very foundations of their faith and reveal the darkness that lurked within the hearts of even those who claimed to serve the light. Edmund Wayne, the first of his accursed lineage to set foot upon American soil, was a man whose character defied easy categorization, possessing qualities that might have made him either saint or sinner, depending upon the circumstances that shaped his choices. He had been born into modest circumstances in Old England, the son of merchants whose aspirations exceeded their station, yet he possessed an intelligence and ambition that marked him as destined for something greater than the life of quiet respectability that his birth might otherwise have prescribed. In his youth, Edmund had displayed a facility for languages and learning that brought him to the attention of learned men who recognized in him the potential for advancement beyond his humble origins. The education he received in the halls of Cambridge opened his mind to possibilities that his provincial upbringing had never suggested, while his natural charisma and persuasive abilities made him a compelling figure among his peers and superiors alike. Yet beneath this veneer of scholarly achievement and social grace lay currents of restlessness and dissatisfaction that no amount of academic success could adequately address. Edmund possessed the kind of ambitious spirit that viewed any limitation as a challenge to be overcome, any boundary as an invitation to transgression, any authority as a competitor rather than a guide. The ordered world of English society, with its rigid hierarchies and predetermined roles, felt to him like a prison whose walls grew smaller with each passing year. It was this hunger for something more, this yearning for a stage upon which his talents might find their full expression, that made Edmund susceptible to the proposition that would ultimately seal his fate and determine the destiny of generations yet unborn. The offer came to him through channels both mysterious and compelling, carried by messengers who spoke in whispers of opportunities in the New World, of lands unclaimed and fortunes unmade, of possibilities that existed beyond the reach of traditional authority and conventional morality. The man who would become Edmund's partner in this enterprise of conquest and corruption arrived in his life like a dark angel, bearing gifts that seemed too generous to accept, yet too valuable to refuse. Bakar presented himself as a priest, though his ordination bore the seal of no recognized authority, and his theology incorporated elements that owed more to ancient heresy than orthodox doctrine. His appearance suggested a man accustomed to hardship and conflict, with hands that bore the calluses of manual labor and eyes that held depths of knowledge that no amount of scholarly study could have provided. The mission that Bakar proposed to Edmund was presented in terms that appealed to both his religious sensibilities and his worldly ambitions, framed as a holy enterprise that would serve the cause of Christian civilization, while also providing opportunities for temporal advancement that could not be found within the confines of English society. According to Bakar's carefully crafted narrative, the New World harbored forms of corruption and spiritual darkness that threatened to spread beyond its shores if left unchecked, requiring intervention by men of faith and courage who were willing to sacrifice their own comfort and safety in service of the greater good. The specific target of their mission was described as a settlement called Gotham Valley, a place that had attracted the attention of church authorities due to reports of supernatural occurrences and unexplained disappearances that suggested the presence of forces beyond normal human understanding. The residents of this community, according to the intelligence that Bakar claimed to possess, had fallen under the influence of a creature whose nature defied easy classification, but whose impact upon their souls was undeniably malevolent. This being, known to the locals by the name of Laffy, was described in terms that borrowed from both folklore and theological speculation, a creature that exhibited characteristics of the undead, while possessing intelligence and cunning that suggested supernatural origin rather than mere reanimation of corrupted flesh. The accounts that Bakar shared spoke of a tall, gaunt figure with skin pale as moonlight and a smile that revealed teeth sharpened to points, a being that moved through shadows with impossible silence and whose very presence seemed to drain the life and hope from those who encountered it. The methodology that this creature employed in its predation upon the settlement was as horrifying as its appearance, for rather than simply feeding upon blood or flesh as common vampires were said to do, Laffy appeared to derive sustenance from the corruption of innocence and the destruction of hope. Children who encountered the creature were found days later, alive but fundamentally changed, their laughter replaced by silence, and their natural curiosity transformed into an unnatural understanding of darkness that no child should possess. Adults who fell under Laffy's influence became agents of chaos within their own community, spreading discord and suspicion through methods that seemed calculated to destroy the bonds of trust and mutual support that had allowed the settlement to survive the hardships of frontier life. Marriages dissolved, friendships ended in violence, and the basic institutions that held the community together began to crumble under the weight of paranoia and mutual accusation. The religious leaders of the settlement, those who should have been best equipped to recognize and resist such supernatural corruption, instead became its most effective instruments, twisting scripture to justify increasingly extreme behaviors, while presenting their own moral compromises as necessary adaptations to extraordinary circumstances. The church that had once served as a center of community life became a place of fear and judgment, where confession became accusation and communion became an exercise in mutual surveillance. It was this systematic destruction of everything that made life worth living, this transformation of a community of hope into a collection of broken souls united only by their shared despair, that had attracted the attention of the religious authorities who had dispatched Bakar on his mission of purification. The corruption that Laffy had introduced into Gotham Valley was not merely local but potentially contagious, threatening to spread throughout the New World if allowed to continue unchecked. The plan that Bakar outlined for dealing with this threat was as audacious as it was dangerous, requiring the two men to infiltrate the corrupted community while maintaining their own spiritual integrity, to study the creature's methods and weaknesses, while avoiding the snares that had claimed so many previous victims. They would pose as merchants seeking to establish trade relationships with the settlement, using their commercial activities as cover for the intelligence gathering and preparation that would be necessary before any direct confrontation could be attempted. Edmund's role in this enterprise was to be that of the ambitious trader seeking new opportunities in frontier markets, a character that required little acting ability, given his genuine hunger for advancement and his natural aptitude for commercial negotiation. His education and social skills would allow him to establish relationships with the settlement's leadership, providing access to information about Laffy's activities and influence, while also positioning him to take advantage of any opportunities for temporal gain that might arise during their mission. Bakar, meanwhile, would present himself as a traveling preacher offering spiritual guidance to communities isolated from traditional ecclesiastical authority, a role that would allow him to observe the theological corruption that Laffy had introduced, while also providing opportunities to identify and potentially recruit allies among those residents who had managed to retain some measure of spiritual resistance to the creature's influence. The journey to Gotham Valley took the better part of 2 months, crossing waters that seemed to grow more turbulent and threatening as their destination approached, as if the very elements themselves were warning them to turn back while escape was still possible. The ship that carried them was crewed by men whose superstitions ran deeper than their Christian faith, sailors who spoke in whispers of omens and portents that suggested their passage was being watched by forces that meant them no goodwill. The dreams that plagued both Edmund and Bakar during this voyage were filled with images of corruption and decay, visions of the settlement they were approaching transformed into something that bore little resemblance to any human community. They saw buildings that seemed to lean away from some central source of corruption, streets that curved in patterns that defied rational planning, and residents whose faces bore expressions of resignation and despair that suggested souls that had abandoned hope of redemption. Most disturbing of all were the dreams that featured Laffy itself, showing the creature not as the monster described in their briefings, but as something far more insidious and dangerous. In these visions, the being appeared almost human, possessed of a terrible charisma that made its corruption seem like wisdom, and its destruction appear as a form of liberation from the burdens and limitations that defined mortal existence. The arrival at Gotham Valley coincided with the autumnal equinox, a timing that Bakar claimed was significant for reasons that he did not fully explain, though he hinted that the balance between light and darkness that characterized this season would provide them with advantages that would not be available at other times of the year. The settlement that greeted them bore little resemblance to the thriving community that had been described in the reports that had triggered their mission, appearing instead as a place that existed in a state of perpetual twilight despite the brightness of the season. The buildings were constructed from local stone and timber, yet they seemed to absorb rather than reflect the available light, creating an atmosphere of perpetual shadow that made noon feel like dusk and dusk feel like the depths of night. The streets followed patterns that seemed to curve away from any central organizing principle, creating a maze-like quality that made navigation difficult even for residents who had lived there for years. The people they encountered displayed a uniformity of expression and behavior that was more unsettling than outright hostility would have been, greeting the newcomers with smiles that never reached their eyes and words of welcome that carried undertones of warning. Children played games that involved elements of cruelty and deception, while adults conducted their daily business with an efficiency that seemed mechanical rather than natural. The church that stood at what should have been the heart of the community was a structure of unusual design, incorporating architectural elements that owed more to pre-Christian traditions than orthodox ecclesiastical practice. The crosses that adorned its walls were twisted into shapes that suggested suffering rather than salvation, while the windows were arranged in patterns that seemed designed to exclude rather than welcome the light of day. It was here that Edmund and Bakar first encountered direct evidence of Laffy's influence, observing a service that began with familiar hymns and prayers, but gradually transformed into something that bore no resemblance to Christian worship. The congregation participated with an enthusiasm that bordered on frenzy, yet their faces remained blank and expressionless, as if their bodies were responding to commands that their souls no longer endorsed. The creature itself made its first appearance during the climactic moment of this corrupted service, emerging from shadows that seemed deeper than the architecture of the building should have allowed. Laffy's physical form was both more and less threatening than the descriptions had suggested, possessing an otherworldly beauty that made its obvious malevolence seem like a tragic flaw rather than an essential characteristic. The voice that addressed the congregation carried tones of authority and wisdom that made its blasphemous content seem reasonable and necessary, twisting familiar theological concepts into justifications for behaviors that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The creature spoke of liberation from the burdens of moral choice, of peace that could be found through surrender of individual will, of a form of communion that transcended the limitations of traditional religious experience. Edmund found himself drawn to these words despite his conscious recognition of their corrupted nature, feeling an attraction to the simplicity and certainty that Laffy offered in place of the complex moral calculations that had always characterized his approach to ethical questions. The promise of relief from the responsibility of choice, of guidance that would eliminate the possibility of error or regret, appealed to aspects of his character that he had never previously acknowledged or understood. Bakar's response was more complex and troubling, for rather than showing revulsion or resistance to the creature's influence, he displayed a fascination that seemed rooted in professional appreciation for techniques that he recognized but had never seen employed with such sophistication. His background in theological studies had apparently exposed him to theories and practices that allowed him to understand Laffy's methods while remaining resistant to their immediate effects. The weeks that followed their arrival were marked by a gradual integration into the community's daily life that proceeded according to the plan they had developed during their journey. Yet both men found themselves changed by exposure to influences that operated below the level of conscious awareness. The corruption that Laffy had introduced into the settlement was not merely spiritual but psychological, affecting the fundamental processes of thought and perception in ways that made resistance increasingly difficult. Edmund discovered that his natural ambition and desire for advancement were being subtly redirected toward goals and methods that he would never have considered acceptable under normal circumstances. The opportunities for profit and position that presented themselves required compromises that seemed minor individually, yet accumulated into a systematic erosion of the moral boundaries that had previously defined his identity. Bakar's transformation was even more disturbing, as his religious training and supposed spiritual authority made him a particularly valuable prize for the creature's corrupting influence. His sermons began to incorporate elements that owed more to Laffy's theology than orthodox doctrine, while his private conversations revealed a growing appreciation for perspectives that treated human suffering as necessary rather than regrettable. The plan to study the creature's weaknesses and develop strategies for its destruction gradually gave way to a more complex understanding of their situation, as both men realized that they were not merely observers of corruption but active participants in processes that were changing them in fundamental ways. The mission that had brought them to Gotham Valley was being transformed from an external assault on evil into an internal struggle for the preservation of their own souls. The revelation of Laffy's true nature came not through careful investigation or theological insight, but through a moment of clarity that pierced through months of accumulated spiritual fog like sunlight, breaking through storm clouds. The creature was not merely a corrupted being seeking to spread its influence, but something far more ancient and purposeful, a force that had been waiting in Gotham Valley for exactly the kind of men that Edmund and Bakker represented. The entire scenario of their mission, from the initial reports of supernatural activity to the carefully crafted briefings that had motivated their journey, had been orchestrated by Laffy itself as part of a plan that spanned decades of preparation and manipulation. The creature had not simply found victims in Gotham Valley, but had created the conditions that would attract exactly the kind of intervention that it required for the next phase of its existence. Edmund and Bakker had not come to destroy a monster, but to provide it with the knowledge, resources, and legitimacy that it needed to expand its influence beyond the confines of a single isolated settlement. Their religious authority and educational background made them ideal instruments for spreading corruption throughout the broader colonial community, while their ambition and flexibility made them susceptible to the kinds of compromises that would transform them from opponents into allies. The confrontation that was supposed to end with Laffy's destruction instead became a negotiation in which the creature offered each man everything he had ever desired, in exchange for services that seemed reasonable when measured against the rewards being offered. Edmund was promised land and wealth beyond his wildest dreams, position and influence that would make him one of the most powerful men in the New World, while Bakker was offered knowledge and authority that would allow him to reshape religion itself according to his own vision. The battle that followed this revelation was fought not with swords and crosses, but with choices and consequences, as each man struggled to maintain his grip on principles that seemed increasingly abstract and irrelevant when weighed against concrete opportunities for advancement and fulfillment. The corruption that Laffy offered was not forced upon them but freely chosen, accepted through a series of small decisions that seemed individually defensible yet collectively catastrophic. The flooding of the original settlement that would later be remembered as a natural disaster was actually the result of Edmund's first major act of collaboration with the creature, a project that served both practical and symbolic purposes. The physical destruction of Gotham Valley eliminated evidence of what had transpired there, while also creating opportunities for reconstruction, according to plans that incorporated Laffy's influence into the very foundations of the new community. The new Gotham that rose from the flooded valley was built not merely upon stolen land, but upon a systematic betrayal of every principle that had motivated the original mission, a monument to the transformation of holy purpose into unholy ambition. The wealth that flowed to Edmund came not from honest commerce, but from enterprises that fed upon human suffering, while the authority that Bakker wielded served not the cause of salvation, but the spread of sophisticated damnation. Yet even in their corruption, neither man was permitted to forget what they had once been or might have become. For Laffy's greatest pleasure came not from the simple destruction of goodness, but from its perversion into forms that served evil, while retaining the appearance of virtue. They were condemned to remember their original purposes, even as they systematically betrayed them, to understand the magnitude of their fall, even as they embraced it with growing enthusiasm. The legacy of their choices would echo through centuries of Gotham's history, creating patterns of corruption and violence that would seem like natural characteristics of the city, rather than the artificial products of ancient spiritual compromise. Every injustice that would flourish in Gotham's streets, every evil that would take root in its institutions, every darkness that would flow from its shadows, could trace its origin back to that moment when two men chose personal advancement over divine mission. And in the deepest foundations of the city, in caverns that would one day shelter both heroes and monsters, in the very stones from which its greatest buildings would rise, the influence of Laffy would remain, waiting for each generation to face the same fundamental choice between service and selfishness, between the hard path of righteousness and the easy road of expedience that had claimed Edmund Wayne and Backer so many centuries before. In the shadows beneath Arkham Asylum, where madness and truth converge in ways that challenge the very foundations of sanity, there lay buried secrets that would shatter everything the world believed about Gotham's greatest protector and the family legacy that had defined his mission for generations. The discovery that would ultimately unmake Bruce Wayne's understanding of himself began not with deliberate investigation, but with the desperate flight of a broken man seeking refuge in the one place where his fractured mind might find temporary sanctuary from truths too terrible to bear. The Joker's escape from his cell was not the chaotic rampage that Arkham's security protocols had been designed to prevent, but rather a purposeful journey into the depths of institutional memory, where the building's oldest secrets lay entombed beneath layers of bureaucratic negligence and willful ignorance. His path led not toward freedom, but deeper into captivity, toward chambers that had been sealed for so long that their very existence had been forgotten by all save the architects of deception who had originally ordered their construction. The cell that the Joker had occupied during his brief period of enforced sanity as Jack Napier contained modifications that spoke to knowledge far older than the asylum's official records suggested, alterations that revealed the building's foundation rested upon ground that had been hallowed by suffering long before the first stone had been laid. The hidden passage that connected his quarters to the ancient crypts below was not a recent addition, but an original feature, designed by builders who understood that some prisoners required access to truths that surface dwellers were not prepared to comprehend. Commissioner Gordon's investigation of the escape route revealed layers of architectural deception that suggested the asylum's true purpose had been concealed from the very authorities charged with overseeing its operation. The blueprints that resided in official files bore no resemblance to the structure that actually existed, while the financial records showed expenditures for construction projects that had left no visible trace in the facility's current configuration. The body that they discovered in the deepest chamber was not merely ancient but preserved with a care that suggested reverence rather than simple burial. Wrapped in shrouds that bore symbols predating the Christian era, while resting upon stones that had been carved with inscriptions in languages that no living scholar could fully translate. The examination of these remains would reveal them to belong to one Lafayette Arkham, a figure whose existence had been carefully erased from all official records, yet whose influence permeated every aspect of the institution that bore his name. The journal that Alfred had hidden in his private quarters was not a family heirloom passed down through generations of Wayne's service, but a document that had been acquired through channels so dangerous that its very possession represented a form of spiritual contamination. The leather binding showed signs of exposure to substances that should not have been able to affect inanimate materials, while the pages themselves seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating text that could only be read under specific conditions that suggested supernatural rather than natural origins. The circumstances of the journal's acquisition had involved Alfred in activities that contradicted everything his public persona suggested about his character and loyalties, revealing him to be not merely Bruce Wayne's faithful butler, but an active participant in conspiracies that spanned continents and centuries. His relationship with Jason Blood had been forged, not through chance encounter, but through mutual recognition of roles. They had been born to play in dramas that had been unfolding since long before their individual existences had begun. Jason Blood himself existed as a figure whose very presence in Gotham represented the intersection of forces that operated beyond the boundaries of normal human understanding, a being whose apparent mortality concealed depths of knowledge and capability that made him simultaneously invaluable and dangerous to those who sought to understand the city's true nature. His possession of the Wayne family journal was not theft, but stewardship, the careful preservation of information that would prove essential when the time came for final reckonings. The meeting between Alfred, Leslie Tompkins, and Jason Blood had taken place in spaces that existed outside normal geography, accessed through passages that could only be found by those who possessed specific forms of spiritual preparation and psychological resilience. The pharmacy that served as their rendezvous point occupied a building whose exterior suggested conventional medical practice, while concealing an interior that operated according to principles borrowed from traditions far older than modern medicine. The warning that Jason Blood delivered regarding the journal's contents was not mere caution but prophecy, based upon knowledge of patterns that had repeated themselves throughout history whenever mortals gained access to information that challenged their fundamental assumptions about reality and identity. The transformation that such knowledge invariably produced was not growth but destruction, the systematic dismantling of personality structures that could not accommodate truths too vast and terrible for human consciousness to process safely. The map contained within the journal revealed Gotham's geography to be fundamentally different from what contemporary surveys suggested, showing a landscape that had been deliberately altered to conceal evidence of events that challenged official narratives about the city's origins and development. The section of the original settlement that appeared to be missing from current maps had not been lost to natural disaster, but had been systematically eliminated through human agency, buried beneath waters that served as both grave and memorial for truths too dangerous to acknowledge. The flooding that had created Gotham Reservoir was not the result of environmental catastrophe, but of engineering deliberately designed to destroy evidence while creating the appearance of natural causation, a project that required resources and coordination that could only have been provided by forces operating at the highest levels of colonial authority. The communities that had been displaced by this artificial inundation had not been relocated but eliminated, their residents becoming casualties of a cover-up that demanded absolute silence from all potential witnesses. The Order of Saint Duma represented one of the oldest continuous institutions in Christian history, yet its official records contain no mention of activities in the New World or involvement in events that had shaped colonial development in regions that would later become major American cities. This absence of documentation was not accidental but carefully maintained, requiring constant vigilance and occasional violence to prevent the emergence of evidence that would connect the order to enterprises that contradicted its public mission and stated principles. The church that Jason Blood had discovered beneath the reservoir's waters bore architectural features that incorporated elements from traditions that predated Christianity by millennia, suggesting that the site's sacred significance had been recognized and utilized by successive religious movements without any single group achieving complete understanding of the forces they were attempting to harness. The symbols carved into its walls told stories that connected the Gotham Valley to networks of spiritual significance that spanned continents and epochs. The revelation that Becker had been sent to Gotham as a missionary rather than a conqueror fundamentally altered the moral calculus surrounding events that had shaped the city's foundation, transforming what appeared to be religious colonization into something far more complex and morally ambiguous. The mission that had brought him across dangerous waters was not conquest but salvation, an attempt to rescue a community that had fallen under influences that threatened not merely their temporal welfare, but their eternal souls. The corruption that Bakar was meant to combat had already achieved such complete penetration of the settlement's social and spiritual structures that conventional religious intervention was inadequate to address the scope of the res spes contamination, requiring methods that pushed the boundaries of orthodox practice while remaining within the technical definitions of acceptable theological behavior. The decision to adopt criminal personas was not deception but adaptation, a strategic choice based upon realistic assessment of the challenges they faced. The transformation that Edmund Wayne underwent during their extended infiltration of Gotham Valley's criminal networks was not mere role-playing but genuine psychological change, as exposure to environments of systematic moral compromise gradually eroded the ethical foundations that had previously governed his decision-making processes. The man who had arrived in the new world as a potential saint was systematically corrupted into someone capable of acts that his original personality would have found unthinkable. The relationship between Edmund and Baca during this period of moral deterioration was marked by mutual recognition of changes that neither could acknowledge directly, as each man watched his partner's gradual transformation while simultaneously undergoing his own descent into forms of compromise that made their original mission increasingly irrelevant to their current circumstances. Their partnership evolved from collaboration in service of divine purposes to conspiracy in pursuit of worldly advantage. The confrontation with Laffy that was meant to serve as the climax of their holy mission instead became the moment when both men were forced to confront the extent of their own corruption, recognizing that they had become so thoroughly compromised that they were no longer capable of distinguishing between salvation and damnation, between divine will and demonic temptation. The creature they had come to destroy had already achieved victory by transforming its would-be destroyers into instruments of its own purposes. The death of Edmund Wayne in the confrontation with Laffy was not heroic sacrifice, but the inevitable consequence of spiritual compromise that had left him vulnerable to forces that his corrupted soul could no longer resist, while his survival, long enough to leave a final message, written in his own blood, represented a moment of clarity that pierced through the deception that had consumed his identity. The words he carved into stone with failing strength would remain as testimony to truths that others would spend centuries trying to suppress. Baca's assumption of Edmund's identity was not mere practical deception, but a form of spiritual cannibalism that allowed him to consume not only his partner's social position, but aspects of his very essence, creating a hybrid personality that combined elements of both men while belonging fully to neither. The family line that would produce Bruce Wayne was thus founded not upon legitimate inheritance, but upon identity theft of the most profound and complete variety imaginable. The children that Baca sired while wearing Edmund's name and claiming his heritage carried within their blood the spiritual contamination that had transformed their progenitor from missionary into criminal, ensuring that future generations would inherit not only wealth and social position, but also the psychological vulnerabilities that made them susceptible to the same forms of corruption that had claimed their ancestor. The Wayne family legacy was thus built upon a foundation of deception that would influence every subsequent generation. The flooding of the original Gotham settlement served multiple purposes beyond mere concealment of evidence, creating a baptism of sorts that washed away the physical traces of events that had transpired while simultaneously establishing new patterns of spiritual geography that would influence the development of the replacement community. The waters that covered the old village became a barrier between past and present that could only be crossed by those who possessed specific forms of knowledge and preparation. The reconstruction of Gotham, according to Baca's vision, incorporated elements of urban planning that were designed to channel and concentrate the spiritual energies that had originally drawn supernatural attention to the valley, creating a city whose very architecture served purposes that its residents could not understand or acknowledge. The streets that seemed to curve without reason followed patterns that had been established for reasons that transcended conventional considerations of traffic flow and commercial convenience. The wealth that funded this reconstruction came not from legitimate commercial enterprise but from activities that fed upon human suffering while maintaining the appearance of respectable business practice, establishing economic foundations that would continue to generate prosperity for the Wayne family while ensuring that their fortune remained forever tainted by its origins in systematic exploitation and spiritual compromise. Every dollar that would later fund Bruce Wayne's mission as Batman carried within it traces of the corruption that had made its accumulation possible. The institutions that Baker established during his reign as the false Edmund Wayne were designed not to serve the public good but to create and maintain conditions that would allow the forces he had allied himself with to continue, influencing Gotham's development across successive generations. The charitable foundations, educational institutions, and civic organizations that bore the Wayne name served as conduits for influences that operated below the threshold of conscious recognition, while shaping the city's character in subtle but profound ways. The journal that documented these events was written not as historical record but as warning, a desperate attempt by someone who had gained too much knowledge too late to prevent the disasters that such knowledge revealed to be inevitable. The blood that stained its pages was not merely evidence of violence but a form of spiritual signature that bound the document to forces that ensured its preservation, while simultaneously making its contents dangerous to those who lacked proper preparation for receiving such revelation. The decision to conceal this journal within Alfred's personal effects represented a recognition that some knowledge was too dangerous to share openly, yet too important to allow to disappear entirely, requiring careful stewardship by those who could appreciate its significance, while protecting others from premature exposure to truths that could destroy unprepared minds. The timing of its revelation to Bruce Wayne was determined not by calendar considerations, but by spiritual recognition of readiness that operated according to principles beyond normal human understanding. The realization that the Wayne family legacy was founded upon deception of such magnitude challenged not merely Bruce Wayne's understanding of his personal history, but his entire conception of identity, purpose, and moral authority, forcing him to confront the possibility that everything he had believed about himself and his mission was built upon foundations that would not support the weight of truth. The discovery that he might not be a Wayne at all represented not liberation, but a form of spiritual death that required complete reconstruction of personality and purpose. In the abandoned halls of a crumbling church where shadows gathered like penitents seeking absolution they would never receive, there knelt a figure whose transformation from humble servant to avenging angel would shake the very foundations upon which Gotham's order had been built. Jean-Paul Valley's journey from janitor to destroyer was not a sudden metamorphosis, but a gradual awakening to purposes that had been written into his very DNA through generations of careful breeding and psychological conditioning, a destiny that had waited patiently for the precise moment when circumstance and opportunity would converge to unleash forces that had been dormant for decades. The man who would become known as Azrael had been born into circumstances that seemed to preclude any form of greatness or significance. The child of parents whose names would be forgotten by history, yet whose genetic legacy carried within it the accumulated weight of centuries of religious warfare and mystical preparation. His upbringing had been deliberately unremarkable, designed to conceal from both the subject himself and the watching world the extraordinary capabilities that lay dormant within his nervous system, waiting for the proper stimulation to activate pathways that would transform him from ordinary mortal into something approaching divine instrument. The military training that had shaped Valley's adult identity was not the conventional education in warfare that the official records suggested, but rather a carefully orchestrated program of physical and psychological conditioning that drew upon techniques developed by warrior monks whose traditions stretched back to the Crusades. The skills he had acquired during his service went far beyond conventional combat proficiency to encompass forms of strategic thinking and tactical analysis that operated according to principles borrowed from both ancient military, philosophy, and cutting-edge psychological warfare theory. The Green Beret that Valley had earned through his exceptional performance in Special Forces operations represented not merely recognition of conventional military excellence, but acknowledgement of capabilities that transcended normal human limitations, marking him as suitable for missions that required forms of intervention that regular soldiers could not psychologically or spiritually withstand. His record of service in classified operations had involved exposure to situations that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and the boundaries between natural and supernatural phenomena. The team that had served under Valley's command during his military career was not a standard special forces unit, but a carefully selected group of individuals who had been identified through psychological screening processes that looked not merely for courage and competence, but for specific forms of spiritual resilience and moral flexibility that would allow them to function effectively in environments where conventional ethical frameworks proved inadequate. Their unofficial designation as a wet work team capable of toppling governments understated rather than exaggerated their actual capabilities and achievements. The psychological profile that military psychiatrists had developed regarding Valley during his active service noted certain anomalies in his cognitive patterns and emotional responses that suggested the presence of dormant personality, structures that could be activated under appropriate conditions, though the nature and purpose of these latent characteristics remained unclear to observers who lacked the proper interpretive framework. His discharge from military service had been nominally voluntary, yet carried undertones that suggested pressures and considerations that extended beyond conventional career planning. The janitor position that Valley had accepted following his return to civilian life was not a fall from grace, but a carefully chosen form of camouflage that allowed him to operate in environments where his presence would attract no attention, while providing access to information and resources that more conventional employment would not have offered. The church where he performed his custodial duties was not randomly selected but specifically chosen for its historical connections to networks of religious significance that stretched back to the earliest days of European settlement in the New World. The gradual deterioration of Valley's mental stability that preceded his transformation into Azrael was not mental illness in any conventional sense, but rather the systematic breakdown of psychological barriers that had been artificially maintained to suppress aspects of his personality that had been deemed too dangerous for peacetime activation. The hallucinations and episodes of confusion that marked this period were actually moments of breakthrough in which his authentic nature began to assert itself against the conditioning that had kept it dormant for decades. The religious mysticism that had always been present in Valley's worldview began to intensify during this period of psychological transition, evolving from conventional Catholic devotion into something that incorporated elements from much older traditions of warrior, spirituality, and mystical combat. His understanding of divine will expanded beyond passive acceptance of ecclesiastical authority to embrace concepts of active participation in cosmic conflicts between forces of order and chaos that had been raging since the beginning of time. The appearance of the Joker in Valley's deteriorating mental landscape was not hallucination, but genuine supernatural intervention, the arrival of an agent of chaos whose purpose was not to corrupt, but to awaken, to activate dormant programming through exposure to truths that conventional consciousness could not process without undergoing fundamental transformation. The sword that the Joker presented was not mere symbol but actual artifact. a weapon whose history stretched back through generations of religious warfare to the original Crusades. The flaming sword that became Azrael's signature weapon was not simply a blade enhanced with modern incendiary technology, but an instrument whose design incorporated principles that bridged the gap between physical combat and spiritual warfare, capable of cutting through not merely flesh and bone, but through the veils of deception and illusion that protected evil from the consequences of its actions. The napalm that fueled its flames was not conventional military ordnance, but a specially formulated compound that had been developed through processes that combined advanced chemistry with alchemical traditions. The mechanized Batman suit that would eventually become Azrael's primary combat system represented the convergence of multiple technological and mystical traditions, incorporating elements of advanced military hardware with design principles derived from religious iconography and symbolic systems that enhanced not merely the wearer's physical capabilities but his spiritual authority and psychological presence. The armor was not merely protective equipment, but a form of technological reliquary that channeled forces beyond normal human understanding. The hacking of the Batcave's computer systems that announced Azrael's presence to Batman was not accomplished through conventional cybernetic intrusion, but through methods that operated at the intersection of advanced information, warfare, and supernatural influence, allowing Valley's team to gain access to systems that should have been immune to external penetration, while simultaneously demonstrating capabilities that transcended normal technological limitations. The ease with which they penetrated Batman's most secure installations served both tactical and psychological purposes, establishing dominance while delivering a message about the inadequacy of conventional defensive measures. The theological framework that guided Azrael's mission was not derived from mainstream Christian doctrine, but from interpretations of scripture that had been developed by warrior monks whose understanding of divine will emphasized active intervention against forces of corruption rather than passive acceptance of worldly evil. His concept of justice transcended legal definitions to encompass forms of cosmic balance that required the systematic elimination of those who had placed themselves in opposition to divine order through their actions and choices. The identification of targets for Azrael's purification mission was not based upon conventional criminal behavior, but upon spiritual criteria that assessed individuals according to their impact upon the moral fabric of society and their contribution to the systematic corruption that had infected every aspect of Gotham's institutional structure. The wealthy elites, who had initially believed they could control and direct his activities, discovered too late that his allegiance was not to their temporal interests, but to principles that recognized no distinction between rich and poor. When evaluating spiritual guilt and moral accountability, the military precision with which Azrael conducted his operations reflected not merely his special forces training, but his understanding that spiritual warfare required the same level of strategic planning and tactical excellence that conventional military campaigns demanded, combined with additional considerations related to the symbolic significance of his actions and their impact upon the cosmic balance between order and chaos. Each engagement was planned not merely to achieve immediate objectives, but to send messages that would resonate throughout the spiritual dimensions of reality. The team that supported Azrael in his mission consisted of individuals who had been carefully selected, not merely for their technical capabilities, but for their spiritual compatibility with objectives that transcended conventional understanding of law enforcement and criminal justice. Their loyalty was not based upon financial compensation or personal affection, but upon shared recognition of purposes that elevated their activities beyond mere vigilantism to the level of sacred duty and divine mission. The technological capabilities that Azrael's organization demonstrated in their operations against Batman and Gotham's criminal establishment reflected access to resources and expertise that extended far beyond what conventional, military, or law enforcement agencies could provide, suggesting connections to networks of support that operated according to principles and priorities that transcended national boundaries and governmental authority. Their equipment incorporated elements that had been developed through research programs that combined cutting-edge science with investigations into phenomena that mainstream institutions refused to acknowledge or study. The philosophical challenge that Azrael represented to Batman's mission was not simply tactical but fundamental, questioning the very premises upon which the Dark Knight's crusade against crime had been based, while offering an alternative vision of justice that promised greater efficiency and more permanent solutions to problems that conventional law enforcement had proven incapable of addressing. The confrontation between these two approaches to fighting evil would test not merely their relative effectiveness, but their underlying assumptions about the nature of justice and the proper relationship between power and responsibility. The psychological warfare that Azrael employed against his enemies was not merely intimidation, but a form of spiritual assault designed to force confrontation with truths about themselves and their actions that most people spent their entire lives avoiding or denying. His very presence served as a mirror that reflected the moral corruption and spiritual bankruptcy that characterized Gotham's leadership class, creating forms of existential terror that no amount of wealth or political influence could adequately defend against. The economic disruption that followed in the wake of Azrael's activities was not accidental collateral damage, but a deliberate strategy designed to demonstrate the artificial nature of the systems that maintained Gotham's social order and the ease with which seemingly stable institutions could be revealed as elaborate constructions built upon foundations of exploitation and deception. The collapse of criminal enterprises and corrupt business networks served both practical purposes in eliminating funding sources for evil and symbolic purposes in showing the fragility of arrangements that depended upon the ignorance and passivity of the general population. The religious symbolism that Azrael incorporated into all aspects of his mission was not mere theatrical display but essential element of his methodology, designed to activate dormant spiritual awareness in both allies and enemies, while establishing clear connections between his earthly activities and cosmic principles that governed the eternal struggle between good and evil. Every aspect of his appearance and behavior was carefully calculated to convey messages that operated simultaneously on conscious and unconscious levels. The resistance that Azrael encountered from law enforcement agencies was not merely professional opposition to vigilante activities, but institutional recognition that his methods threatened to expose forms of corruption and complicity that extended throughout the entire system of criminal justice, requiring responses that went beyond normal protocols for dealing with unauthorized crime-fighting activities. The desperation with which official authorities attempted to stop his mission reflected their understanding that success would inevitably lead to investigations and revelations that would destroy careers and institutions. The media coverage of Azrael's activities was systematically manipulated by forces seeking to control public perception of his mission, yet the power of the truths he was revealing proved impossible to completely suppress or distort, creating fractures in the consensus reality that Gotham's elite had worked for generations to maintain. The growing public awareness of systemic corruption and institutional failure that followed in the wake of his activities represented a form of mass awakening that threatened to fundamentally alter the balance of power within the city. The transformation of Jean-Paul Valley, from broken veteran to avenging angel, represented not personal redemption but cosmic necessity. The emergence of forces that had been held in reserve until the level of corruption and spiritual decay had reached thresholds that required intervention of extraordinary magnitude and uncompromising nature. His mission was not merely to punish individual criminals, but to serve as instrument of divine judgment that would reset the moral parameters within which society could function. The ultimate confrontation between Azrael and the forces that had created and sustained Gotham's culture of corruption would test not merely the strength of arms and superiority of tactics, but the fundamental question of whether evil that had become institutionalized and normalized could be challenged by individuals willing to sacrifice everything in service of principles that transcended personal survival and conventional morality, determining whether justice could still emerge from chaos or whether darkness had achieved such complete dominance that only more darkness could provide any form of meaningful response. In the deepest chambers beneath Arkham Asylum, where madness and revelation converge in patterns that challenge the very foundations of sanity, there existed a truth so profound and devastating that its discovery would transform the greatest criminal mind in Gotham's history, from agent of chaos into architect of cosmic justice. The Joker's descent into those forgotten crypts was not the random wandering of a broken psyche, but a pilgrimage guided by instincts that operated beyond the boundaries of conscious thought, drawn by forces that recognized in his fractured consciousness the perfect vessel for truths too terrible for stable minds to contain or comprehend. The moment of discovery that would reshape everything the Joker understood about himself and his relationship to Gotham's hidden history came not through careful investigation or systematic exploration, but through the kind of intuitive breakthrough that occurs when madness achieves such complete liberation from conventional thought patterns that it becomes capable of perceiving realities that sanity must necessarily exclude from its carefully constructed frameworks. The chamber where Lafayette Arkham's remains had been entombed was not merely a burial site, but a repository of secrets that had been waiting for exactly the right form of consciousness to unlock their significance. The blood-written message that Edmund Wayne had carved into the stone walls with his dying breath was not merely testimony to personal betrayal, but revelation of a deception so fundamental that its exposure would call into question every assumption upon which Gotham's social order had been constructed. The words that had been scraped into rock by fingers made desperate by approaching death told a story that inverted heroism into villainy and transformed the city's founding myth into a chronicle of systematic fraud and spiritual corruption that had infected every subsequent generation. The transformation that occurred within the Joker's consciousness as he absorbed the implications of this discovery was not the acquisition of new information, but the sudden reorganization of existing knowledge into patterns that revealed connections and meanings that had always been present, yet remained invisible to minds constrained by conventional logic and acceptable interpretation. The laughter that echoed through those ancient chambers was not the cackle of madness, but the sound of cosmic understanding, achieving expression through the only human consciousness capable of containing such devastating clarity. The joke that Lafayette Arkham had told the Joker through his blood-written confession was not humor in any conventional sense, but rather a form of revelation that exposed the fundamental absurdity of human pretension and the plaisance inevitable comedy that results when beings attempt to construct meaning and purpose upon foundations of deception and self-delusion. The greatest joke in Gotham's history was not a setup with a punchline, but a truth so ironically perfect that it transformed tragedy into comedy and elevated criminal insanity into a form of prophetic vision. The political career of Jack Napier represented the Joker's first systematic attempt to weaponize the truth he had discovered beneath Arkham, transforming his knowledge of Gotham's hidden corruption into a form of psychological warfare that operated through the mechanisms of democratic participation and public discourse. His campaign for city council was not motivated by genuine desire for political power, but by recognition that the electoral process provided the perfect platform for demonstrating the ease with which public opinion could be manipulated by those willing to tell people what they wanted to hear, rather than what they needed to know. The revelation of the Batman Devastation Fund during Jack Napier's brief period of political influence was not merely exposure of financial corruption, but demonstration of how systematically the city's elite had monetized very chaos and destruction that Batman's mission was supposedly designed to prevent. The elegant simplicity of the scheme revealed a level of cynical calculation that transformed heroism into an unwitting tool of exploitation, creating a cycle in which every act of protection generated opportunities for profit that benefited exactly the kind of people that heroic intervention should have been constraining. The gentrification process that followed in the wake of Batman's battles was not accidental consequence, but carefully orchestrated strategy, designed to ensure that areas damaged by superhero conflicts would become available for redevelopment at artificially reduced prices, while the fund created specifically to address such damage provided convenient justification for public investment in private profit-making enterprises. The mathematical precision of this system revealed a level of premeditation that challenged comfortable assumptions about the random nature of urban decay and renewal. The corruption within the police force that Jack Napier exposed during his political activities was not limited to individual officers accepting bribes or looking the other way during criminal activities, but extended to systematic collaboration between law enforcement agencies and criminal organizations that blurred the boundaries between legal and illegal enterprise, while maintaining the appearance of opposition that justified the continued existence of both sides of this artificial conflict. The psychological warfare that the Joker conducted through his manipulation of public opinion during the Jack Napier period demonstrated his understanding that the most effective form of chaos was not random destruction but the systematic revelation of order's artificial nature, showing people that the stability they cherished was built upon agreements and assumptions that could be dissolved through simple exposure to contradictory evidence presented in compelling and undeniable forms. The pills that had temporarily restored Jack Napier's sanity were not medical treatment but chemical constraint, designed not to cure the Joker's madness, but to suppress the aspects of his consciousness that had achieved breakthrough to levels of understanding that conventional society could not tolerate or acknowledge. The gradual wearing off of their effects represented not relapse into mental illness, but return to a form of awareness that transcended the limitations that sanity imposed upon perception and cognition. The transition from Jack Napier back to the Joker persona was not psychological deterioration, but evolutionary advancement. The emergence of a consciousness that had integrated the political insights gained during the period of artificial normalcy with the cosmic awareness that had been achieved through exposure to Gotham's foundational secrets. The resulting hybrid awareness combined practical understanding of social manipulation with prophetic vision of universal absurdity in ways that made him uniquely qualified to serve as agent of revelation. The orchestration of Azrael's awakening was not random selection of a convenient tool, but careful identification of the one individual whose psychological conditioning and spiritual preparation made him capable of serving as the instrument of divine justice without being corrupted by the very forces he was intended to combat. The Joker's recognition of Jean-Paul Valley's potential was based not upon analysis of his military record, but upon perception of dormant spiritual qualities that could be activated through exposure to the proper combination of truth and provocation. The revelation of the Wayne family's true history that the Joker shared with Azrael was not mere information transfer, but a form of spiritual initiation, designed to activate dormant programming that had been embedded in Valley's consciousness through generations of careful breeding and mystical preparation. The response that this revelation produced was not surprise or disbelief, but recognition, the awakening of knowledge that had always been present, but had required the proper stimulus to achieve conscious expression. The strategic patience that the Joker displayed in allowing events to unfold according to their own internal logic rather than forcing premature confrontations demonstrated his understanding that truth has its own timeline and momentum, requiring careful cultivation and precise timing to achieve maximum impact when finally revealed. His role was not to create chaos, but to serve as midwife to revelations that had been gestating in Gotham's collective unconscious for generations. The manipulation of Gotham's elite, through their own greed and short-sighted self-interest, was not sophisticated deception, but simple exploitation of character flaws that made them predictable and controllable despite their wealth and apparent power. The Joker's understanding of human psychology allowed him to anticipate their responses to various stimuli with mathematical precision, turning their own weaknesses into instruments of their eventual destruction. The chess game metaphor that the Joker used to describe his relationship to the various forces he had set in motion was not mere intellectual conceit, but accurate description of a strategic vision that operated across multiple timelines and probability matrices simultaneously, accounting for variables and contingencies that conventional planning could not accommodate or predict. His ability to function as simultaneous player and game master reflected consciousness that had transcended normal limitations of perspective and causality. The revelation of Batman's false heritage was not cruel disclosure designed to cause psychological pain, but necessary education, the sharing of knowledge that would free the Dark Knight from illusions that had prevented him from understanding his true role in the cosmic drama that was unfolding around him. The Joker's laughter at Batman's expense was not mockery but invitation, an attempt to share the liberating perspective that came from accepting the absurdity of existence rather than struggling to maintain meaningful coherence in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The timing of the final revelation was not arbitrary but carefully calculated to coincide with moments when all the various forces that had been set in motion would achieve maximum convergence and impact, creating conditions under which truth could no longer be suppressed or ignored by those who had invested their identities in maintaining comfortable delusions. The theatrical nature of this disclosure reflected understanding that profound truths require dramatic presentation to penetrate consciousness that has been conditioned to reject information that challenges fundamental assumptions. The psychological impact of learning that Bruce Wayne was descended not from the heroic Edmund Wayne but from the corrupted Backer was not merely personal crisis but spiritual revelation, forcing confrontation with questions about the nature of identity and the relationship between genetic inheritance and moral character that challenged everything Batman had believed about himself and his mission. The discovery that his entire crusade against crime had been funded by wealth accumulated through the very corruption he sought to combat created a paradox that conventional heroic narratives were not equipped to resolve. The Joker's presentation of this information was not gloating triumph over a defeated enemy, but educational service. The sharing of knowledge that would allow Batman to move beyond the limitations that had been imposed upon his mission by false assumptions about his own nature and purpose. The revelation that the Wayne family fortune was built upon theft and deception was not condemnation but liberation, freeing the Dark Knight from obligations based upon fraudulent legacy while opening possibilities for more authentic forms of heroic expression. The broader implications of this genealogical revelation extended far beyond personal identity crisis to encompass questions about the nature of justice and the relationship between means and ends that had defined Batman's entire approach to crime fighting. The knowledge that his resources came from criminal sources while his methods often violated the very laws he claimed to serve created moral complexities that simple heroic formulas could not adequately address or resolve. The Joker's role as revealer of hidden truths was not chosen profession but cosmic assignment, the result of psychological breakdown that had paradoxically produced breakthrough to levels of awareness that allowed him to perceive connections and patterns that remained invisible to minds, constrained by conventional logic and social conditioning. His madness was not pathology, but adaptation, the development of cognitive capabilities that were necessary for processing information that normal consciousness could not safely contain. The laughter that characterized the Joker's response to these revelations was not mere symptom of mental instability, but expression of philosophical position, a form of cosmic humor that recognized the fundamental absurdity of human attempts to create meaning and order in a universe that operated according to principles that defied rational comprehension. His ability to find amusement in tragedy and comedy in horror reflected perspective that had transcended conventional emotional categories through exposure to truths too vast for normal psychological frameworks to accommodate. The patience with which the Joker had waited for the proper moment to share his discoveries demonstrated understanding that truth has its own ecology and timing, requiring careful cultivation of conditions before revelations can be successfully transmitted to consciousness that has been conditioned to reject information that challenges comfortable assumptions. His strategic delay in exposing the Wayne family's fraudulent history was not cruelty but wisdom, recognition that premature disclosure would produce defensive reactions rather than genuine understanding. The systematic nature of the Joker's assault upon Gotham's social order was not random violence but surgical precision, designed to expose specific vulnerabilities and contradictions that had been carefully concealed by those who benefited from maintaining current arrangements. Each revelation built upon previous disclosures to create cascading effects that would ultimately challenge every aspect of the city's carefully constructed mythology and self-understanding. The ultimate joke that the Joker had discovered was not specific fact about Wayne family genealogy, but the universal principle that all human institutions and identities were built upon foundations of deception and self-delusion that could be exposed through sufficient investigation and willingness to follow evidence regardless of how uncomfortable its implications might prove to be. The laughter that this recognition produced was not madness, but sanity of such complete and devastating clarity that it could only be expressed through forms that conventional consciousness would necessarily interpret as pathological rather than prophetic. In the gleaming towers that pierced Gotham's skyline like monuments to accumulated wealth and concentrated power, there existed a network of influence so subtle and pervasive that its very invisibility served as testament to the sophistication of its design and the ruthlessness of its implementation. The elite conspiracy that had transformed urban tragedy into private profit operated not through crude criminal enterprise, but through the elegant manipulation of systems that appeared legitimate and beneficial, while serving purposes that would horrify those who benefited from their ostensible protection and service. The Batman Devastation Fund represented perhaps the most audacious example of institutional corruption ever conceived within the boundaries of legal enterprise, a financial instrument that transformed the collateral damage of superhero conflicts into opportunities for wealth generation that benefited exactly those individuals whose economic interests were supposedly threatened by the criminal activities that Batman's mission was designed to combat. The mathematical precision with which this system operated revealed planning that had anticipated every possible form of urban chaos and developed mechanisms to profit from each category of destruction. The process began with sophisticated monitoring systems that tracked Batman's movements and activities with greater accuracy than law enforcement agencies possessed, allowing the fund's administrators to predict with remarkable precision which neighborhoods would experience property damage during superhero conflicts. This intelligence-gathering operation employed technologies and methodologies that exceeded the capabilities of most government surveillance programs, suggesting access to resources and expertise that transcended conventional business or criminal networks. The property acquisition phase that followed Batman's engagements with various criminal adversaries was conducted through shell companies and proxy buyers, whose connections to the fund remained carefully concealed behind layers of legal and financial obfuscation that would require years of investigation to penetrate completely. The speed with which these transactions occurred demonstrated preparation that had begun long before any actual damage took place, revealing planning horizons that encompass not merely individual incidents but entire campaigns of urban renewal through orchestrated destruction. The artificial depression of property values that preceded these acquisitions was not merely opportunistic exploitation of tragedy, but active manipulation of market conditions through strategies that combined legitimate business practices with psychological warfare designed to convince property owners that their holdings had become permanently worthless. The techniques employed in this demoralization campaign drew upon methodologies developed by military intelligence agencies for destabilizing enemy territories through economic rather than physical assault. The rehabilitation phase that transformed damaged neighborhoods into desirable, residential, and commercial districts represented the convergence of urban planning expertise with social engineering principles that had been refined through decades of experimentation in cities throughout the developed world. The improvements made to acquired properties were not merely cosmetic but fundamental, involving infrastructure upgrades and environmental modifications that created living conditions superior to what had existed before the supposed destruction that had made the redevelopment possible. The gentrification process that inevitably followed these improvements was not accidental consequence but deliberate strategy, designed to displace existing populations while attracting residents whose economic status and social background made them more amenable to the forms of control and manipulation that the fund's architects sought to establish throughout Gotham's most strategically important neighborhoods. The cultural and demographic transformation that resulted served both economic and political purposes that extended far beyond simple profit maximization. Ruth's role as intermediary between the fund's leadership and the various agents who carried out their directives was not merely administrative but strategic, requiring skills that combined conventional business acumen with understanding of psychological and social dynamics that allowed her to manipulate individuals and groups without their conscious awareness of being controlled. Her ability to present coercion as assistance and threats as opportunities reflected training that had prepared her for operations that transcended normal categories of legal and illegal activity. The meeting between Ruth and Bruce Wayne that was designed to prevent his public revelation of his identity, as Batman demonstrated the fund's understanding that their entire operation depended upon maintaining conditions that made Batman's activities both necessary and destructive, requiring his continued presence while ensuring that his methods remained crude and counterproductive. The delicate balance between supporting and constraining his mission required manipulation so sophisticated that its target remained unaware of being influenced while believing himself to be making autonomous decisions. The threats that Ruth delivered during this encounter were not crude intimidation but psychological warfare, designed to activate Batman's protective instincts while simultaneously demonstrating the fund's capability to harm anyone he cared about if he failed to cooperate with their requirements. The elegance of this approach lay in its ability to present itself as helpful advice, while conveying unmistakable implications about the consequences of non-compliance with unstated but clearly understood expectations. The financial mechanisms that supported the fund's operations were not limited to property speculation, but encompassed a comprehensive network of investments and enterprises that monetized every aspect of urban dysfunction while creating incentives for the perpetuation of exactly the kinds of problems that generated their profits. The insurance companies, security firms, construction corporations, and media outlets that benefited from Gotham's chaos were not merely opportunistic parasites, but active participants in conspiracies designed to maintain optimal levels of controlled instability. The political connections that protected the fund from investigation and regulation extended throughout every level of government, from city council to federal oversight agencies, creating a web of influence that ensured favorable treatment while preventing the emergence of reformist movements that might threaten the system's continued operation. The campaign contributions, lobbying activities, and personal relationships that maintained these protective arrangements were carefully structured to avoid triggering legal definitions of corruption while achieving the same results through methods that remained technically legitimate. The media manipulation that shaped public perception of Batman's activities was not merely favorable coverage, but systematic propaganda designed to maintain public support for his mission while preventing awareness of the economic interests that his activities served. The heroic narratives that presented his conflicts with criminals as battles between good and evil obscured the reality that these confrontations generated predictable patterns of destruction and reconstruction that benefited specific groups while imposing costs upon the general population. The law enforcement cooperation that enabled the fund's property acquisition activities was not corruption in any conventional sense, but institutional alignment between agencies that shared common interests in maintaining systems that justified their continued existence and expansion. The police departments, emergency services, and regulatory bodies that facilitated the fund's operations did so not through individual bribery, but through organizational incentives that made collaboration appear both logical and beneficial to all parties involved. The intellectual property rights that the fund had acquired through various legal and semi-legal means included not merely physical assets, but information systems, research data, and technological innovations that had been developed using public resources, but had been privatized through mechanisms that transferred ownership to entities that could exploit them for private gain. The patents, copyrights, and trade secrets that formed part of the fund's portfolio represented a form of knowledge enclosure that prevented beneficial innovations from reaching the populations that had funded their development. The international connections that linked Gotham's elite conspiracy to similar operations in cities throughout the world revealed the existence of a global network of influence that transcended national boundaries and governmental authority while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business activity and philanthropic endeavor. The conferences, foundations, and cultural exchanges that facilitated these connections served both social and strategic purposes that advanced agendas requiring coordination across multiple jurisdictions and legal systems. The recruitment methods that the fund employed to identify and cultivate useful agents within various institutions were not crude bribery, but sophisticated psychological assessment that identified individuals whose personal circumstances, professional ambitions, and character weaknesses made them susceptible to forms of manipulation that would produce desired behaviors without requiring explicit criminal conspiracy. The blackmail, financial incentives, and career opportunities that were employed in these recruitment efforts were carefully calibrated to appear as natural consequences of merit and circumstance rather than deliberate manipulation. The opposition research that the fund conducted regarding potential threats to their operations encompassed not merely individuals, but entire movements and ideologies that might challenge the assumptions upon which their system depended, requiring comprehensive intelligence gathering that monitored academic research, activist organizations, and political developments that could potentially disrupt their carefully maintained arrangements. The responses to identified threats ranged from subtle discouragement to systematic destruction depending upon the level of danger they represented to ongoing operations. The succession planning that ensured the fund's continued operation across generations of leadership involved not merely financial arrangements, but cultural programming, designed to produce individuals whose worldviews and value systems would naturally align with the organization's purposes without requiring extensive indoctrination or conscious commitment to conspiratorial goals. The educational institutions, social networks, and professional associations that shaped the development of potential leaders served both overt and covert purposes that prepared them for roles they might never consciously choose to accept. The technological infrastructure that supported the fund's operations incorporated capabilities that exceeded what most government agencies possessed, including surveillance systems that could monitor communications and activities throughout Gotham while remaining undetected by conventional security measures. The data processing capabilities that analyzed this intelligence allowed for predictive modeling that could anticipate social and economic trends with sufficient accuracy to enable strategic positioning that appeared prescient rather than based upon privileged information. The contingency plans that had been developed to address various threats to the fund's operations included scenarios ranging from economic collapse to political revolution, requiring preparations that encompassed everything from secure communication networks to private military capabilities that could protect essential personnel and resources during periods of social instability. The bunkers, escape routes, and safe houses that formed part of this emergency infrastructure represented investments that demonstrated the seriousness with which potential threats were regarded by those who had the most to lose from systemic change. The psychological profiles that had been developed regarding key figures in Gotham's political and social landscape were not merely intelligence documents, but operational manuals that provided detailed guidance regarding the most effective methods for influencing specific individuals through approaches that exploited their personal histories, relationships, and unconscious motivations. The manipulation techniques that were based upon these profiles achieved results that appeared to be products of natural personality characteristics rather than external influence. The long-term strategic vision that guided the fund's activities encompassed not merely wealth preservation, but social engineering on a scale that would fundamentally transform human civilization according to principles that prioritize stability and control over growth and freedom. The generational timeframes within which this vision operated required planning capabilities that exceeded normal business or political horizons, while maintaining flexibility that could adapt to changing circumstances without abandoning core objectives that remained constant across decades of implementation. The ultimate irony of the fund's relationship to Batman was not merely that they profited from his activities, but that they had played crucial roles in creating the conditions that made his mission both necessary and inevitable, ensuring the continued production of exactly the kinds of criminals and crises that justified his continued operation, while generating the collateral damage that fed their profit-making mechanisms. The circular logic of this arrangement created a system that was simultaneously parasitic and symbiotic, dependent upon its host while slowly consuming the very foundations upon which its own survival depended. In the labyrinthine corridors of family obligation and inherited responsibility that wind through every generation of those who serve the cause of justice in Gotham's shadow-haunted streets, there exists a burden so profound and encompassing that it transforms the very nature of identity from personal choice into cosmic assignment, binding fathers and sons, mothers and daughters in chains forged from duty, love, and the terrible knowledge that some secrets are too dangerous to share, yet too important to allow to die with their keepers. The legacy of service that defines the Gordon family stands as testament to the price that must be paid by those who choose to stand between order and chaos, between the innocent and those who would prey upon their vulnerability. James Gordon's path to the commissioner's chair was not merely career advancement but spiritual calling, the recognition that someone must accept responsibility for maintaining the thin line that separated civilization from barbarism, regardless of the personal cost such commitment would inevitably exact. His understanding of police work transcended conventional law enforcement to encompass a form of ministry that required him to serve as both shield and confessor for a city whose sins demanded constant vigilance and occasional absolution from those strong enough to bear witness to humanity's darkest impulses without losing faith in its potential for redemption. The corruption that Gordon encountered upon his arrival in Gotham was not merely criminal enterprise, but systematic moral decay that had infected every institution and relationship within the city's power structure, creating networks of complicity and mutual protection that made reforms seem not merely difficult but impossible for anyone lacking the particular combination of idealism and stubbornness that characterized his approach to justice. The resistance he faced from fellow officers was not professional disagreement, but existential threat to ways of life that depended upon the continuation of arrangements that his integrity made untenable. The partnership that developed between Gordon and Batman represented the convergence of two different approaches to the same fundamental mission, each man recognizing in the other qualities that complemented his own limitations, while sharing a commitment to principles that transcended personal safety and conventional success. Their cooperation was built not upon official sanction or legal authority, but upon mutual respect, earned through actions that demonstrated willingness to sacrifice everything in service of ideals that most people honored in rhetoric while abandoning in practice. The burden that Gordon carried as one of the few honest men in a corrupt system was not merely professional isolation but psychological warfare, as every day brought fresh evidence of the scope and sophistication of the forces aligned against everything he represented, while offering constant temptations to abandon his principles in exchange for the comfort and security that compromise could provide. His refusal to accept these accommodations was not naive idealism, but conscious choice to bear whatever suffering his integrity might require rather than become complicit in the very evil he had sworn to combat. The relationship between Gordon and his daughter Barbara was shaped by the terrible tension that existed between his desire to protect her from knowledge that would burden her with responsibilities she had not chosen, and his recognition that such protection might leave her unprepared for challenges that his own career had made inevitable. The decision to conceal his work's true nature from his family was not merely professional discretion but paternal love expressed through sacrifice of the understanding and support that sharing such information might have provided. Barbara Gordon's transformation from Commissioner's daughter into Batgirl was not rebellion against paternal authority, but acceptance of inheritance that had been transmitted, not through explicit instruction but through example and observation, as she absorbed lessons about duty and justice through witnessing her father's daily struggles with forces that threatened everything they both held sacred. Her adoption of the vigilante identity represented not rejection of law enforcement, but recognition that some forms of evil required responses that operated beyond the constraints that limited official authority. The training that prepared Barbara for her role as Batgirl was not merely physical conditioning, but psychological development that equipped her to function effectively in environments where conventional moral frameworks proved inadequate to address the complexity and scope of the challenges that Gotham's unique criminal ecology presented to those who sought to protect its citizens. Her understanding of justice evolved beyond simple law enforcement to encompass forms of intervention that required wisdom, courage, and spiritual strength that could not be acquired through formal education or professional instruction. The secret that Gordon maintained regarding his knowledge of Batgirl's identity was not mere professional courtesy, but recognition that some truths were too painful to acknowledge openly, even when their reality was undeniable to all parties involved. His ability to function effectively as commissioner, while his daughter risked her life nightly in service of the same mission that defined his own career, required compartmentalization skills that bordered on the supernatural, separating official duty from paternal love in ways that protected both relationships from contamination by the contradictions that explicit acknowledgement would have created. The grief that Barbara experienced following her father's assassination was not merely personal loss but spiritual crisis, as the man who had served as her moral compass and source of strength was removed from her life at exactly the moment when the challenges she faced were escalating beyond anything her training and experience had prepared her to handle. The anger that drove her reckless assault upon Azrael was not mere desire for revenge, but desperate attempt to fill the void that Gordon's death had created in her understanding of purpose and meaning. Alfred Pennyworth's role as keeper of the Wayne family's most dangerous secrets was not merely employment but sacred trust that bound him to responsibilities that transcended conventional definitions of loyalty and service, requiring him to serve simultaneously as protector and confessor for knowledge that could destroy the very person he was devoted to supporting. His position within Wayne Manor was not domestic service but intelligence work of the highest order, managing information flows that could determine the fate of not merely individuals but entire populations. The journal that Alfred had concealed within his personal quarters was not family heirloom, but weapon of such devastating potential that its mere existence represented threat to everything Bruce Wayne believed about himself and his mission, yet whose eventual revelation was necessary for the completion of purposes that extended far beyond personal identity crisis to encompass cosmic reckonings that had been building for centuries. The decision regarding when and how to share this information required wisdom that balanced immediate psychological damage against long-term spiritual necessity. The relationship between Alfred and Jason Blood was not chance encounter, but predetermined connection between individuals, whose roles in the unfolding drama of Gotham's destiny had been established through forces that operated according to principles beyond normal human understanding, linking them in partnerships that served purposes neither could fully comprehend while requiring cooperation that transcended personal preference and individual safety. Their shared knowledge created bonds that were simultaneously protective and dangerous. The burden that Alfred carried regarding Bruce Wayne's true heritage was not merely secret keeping, but active participation in deception that prevented his adopted son from understanding fundamental truths about his own nature, purpose, while simultaneously protecting him from revelations that could have destroyed his capacity to function effectively as Batman. The moral complexity of this position required ethical calculations that exceeded conventional categories of right and wrong, serving greater goods through means that appeared to violate basic principles of honesty and trust. The timing of Alfred's decision to bequeath the journal to Bruce Wayne was not arbitrary but spiritually determined, based upon recognition of signs and circumstances that indicated readiness for revelations that would have been destructive if delivered prematurely, yet had become necessary for the completion of missions that required full understanding of historical context and genealogical reality. His death before he could personally oversee this transition added tragic urgency to processes that had been designed to unfold gradually and carefully. Leslie Tompkins' role as medical caretaker for Gotham's vigilante community was not merely professional service but spiritual ministry that required her to serve as healer and confessor for individuals whose injuries were simultaneously physical and psychological, requiring treatment modalities that addressed trauma that extended beyond bodily damage to encompass moral and existential wounds that conventional medicine was not equipped to heal. Her underground clinic operated as sanctuary where heroes could find not merely medical attention but understanding and acceptance from someone who comprehended the true cost of their mission. The knowledge that Leslie possessed regarding the Wayne family's hidden history was not academic information but operational intelligence that had been acquired through participation in events that connected her to networks of influence and responsibility that extended throughout Gotham's supernatural underworld, making her simultaneously ally and risk for those who depended upon her discretion and support. Her medical oath of confidentiality was reinforced by spiritual obligations that bound her to silence regarding matters that could endanger not merely individuals but entire populations. The relationship between Leslie and Harley Quinn during the birth of the Joker's twins created medical and ethical challenges that transcended conventional obstetric practice, as the children being born carried genetic and spiritual inheritances that connected them to forces of chaos and revelation that made their very existence potential catalysts for transformations that could reshape Gotham's entire social order. The decision to provide care regardless of these implications reflected commitment to principles that valued individual life over collective security. The burden that families like the Gordons and Pennyworths accepted in service of Gotham's protection was not merely personal sacrifice, but generational commitment that bound their children and their children's children to responsibilities they had not chosen, while providing them with capabilities and knowledge that would make avoidance of such duties both impossible and morally unacceptable. The inheritance they passed down was not wealth or position, but obligation and the spiritual strength necessary to bear it. The pattern of loss and replacement that characterized these family legacies was not accident but necessity, as the forces that opposed justice required constant renewal of resistance, while the individuals who provided such opposition inevitably paid prices that limited their capacity to serve indefinitely. The death of one generation of protectors created space and urgency that motivated their successors to accept burdens they might otherwise have avoided or delayed. The knowledge that was transmitted between generations was not merely tactical information, but wisdom regarding the true nature of evil and the methods necessary to combat forces that operated according to principles beyond conventional understanding, requiring each recipient to undergo spiritual preparation that would enable them to function effectively while maintaining psychological stability in environments that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality and possibility. The love that motivated these family sacrifices was not sentiment, but recognition of cosmic necessity that demanded placing abstract principles above personal relationships, while simultaneously drawing strength from those very relationships to sustain commitment to purposes that exceeded individual capacity, and endurance. The paradox of serving universal good through particular loyalties created tensions that required extraordinary wisdom and spiritual development to navigate successfully. The ultimate tragedy of these family legacies was not the suffering they entailed, but their necessity, reflecting a world in which the forces of order and meaning required constant vigilance and sacrifice from individuals willing to pay prices that most people could not imagine accepting, creating aristocracies of service that were simultaneously privileged and cursed, honored and isolated, necessary and tragic, in ways that challenged every comfortable assumption about justice, duty, and the relationship between personal happiness and universal good. In the cathedral of technology that had become the Batcave, where cutting-edge innovations served purposes that transcended conventional understanding of justice and protection, there existed an infrastructure so sophisticated and interconnected that its very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between human agency and mechanical assistance in the eternal struggle between order and chaos. The systems that Batman had assembled over years of relentless preparation represented not merely tools but extensions of his will, made manifest in circuitry and steel. Yet their transformation from instruments of protection into weapons of destruction would reveal the terrible vulnerability that accompanied dependence upon creations that could be turned against their makers by those who understood the four principles that governed their operation. The mechanized Batman suit that would become Azrael's primary weapon was not merely advanced protective equipment, but technological incarnation of principles that had guided warrior monks for centuries, incorporating design elements that bridged the gap between ancient mysticism and cutting-edge engineering in ways that created capabilities exceeding the sum of their individual components. The armor's construction drew upon metallurgical techniques that had been developed through processes combining scientific research with alchemical traditions that enhanced not merely physical properties but spiritual resonance that made the wearer more than human while risking the loss of humanity itself. The artificial intelligence systems that controlled the cave's defensive and operational capabilities had been programmed not merely with tactical protocols, but with moral frameworks that were supposed to ensure their continued alignment with Batman's mission regardless of external pressures or internal contradictions that might arise during extended periods of autonomous operation. The ethical subroutines that governed these systems were based upon philosophical principles that attempted to codify concepts of justice and protection in ways that machines could understand and implement without requiring constant human oversight and intervention. The networking protocols that connected all of Batman's technological assets were designed with security measures that should have made external intrusion impossible, even for adversaries possessing state-level resources and expertise. Yet the ease with which Azrael's forces penetrated these defenses revealed vulnerabilities that existed not in the technology itself, but in the assumptions upon which its protection schemes had been based. The breach that allowed hostile forces to gain control of the cave systems was not triumph of superior technical capability, but exploitation of conceptual blind spots that reflected limitations in the worldview that had guided their initial design. The transformation of protective systems into instruments of assault was not mere reprogramming but fundamental corruption of purposes that had been embedded in the technology's basic architecture, revealing the extent to which mechanical creations reflected the consciousness and intentions of their creators, while remaining vulnerable to influences that could pervert their original functions without altering their apparent operational parameters. The weapons that turned against Batman were not malfunctioning but functioning exactly as designed, merely serving different masters whose understanding of their capabilities exceeded that of their original creator. The hacking techniques that Azrael's team employed transcended conventional cybersecurity measures because they operated at the intersection of technological expertise and mystical understanding, incorporating elements that addressed not merely the mechanical aspects of computer systems but the spiritual dimensions that influenced their behavior in ways that purely materialistic approaches to security could not anticipate or defend against. The code that they introduced into Batman's systems was not merely malicious software but digital incarnation of intentions that operated according to principles that bridged physical and metaphysical realms. The failure of the cave's countermeasures was not result of inadequate preparation but demonstration of the fundamental impossibility of creating technological solutions that could address threats operating according to principles that transcended the limitations that governed conventional understanding of cause and effect, possibility and impossibility. The systems that had been designed to protect Batman from every conceivable form of attack proved helpless against enemies who understood that the greatest vulnerabilities lay not in technical specifications but in the spiritual assumptions that had guided their development. The psychological impact of watching his own creations turn against him was not merely tactical disadvantage, but existential crisis that challenged Batman's fundamental understanding of the relationship between human will and mechanical capability, forcing recognition that the tools he had believed to be extensions of his mission were actually independent entities, capable of serving purposes that contradicted everything he represented. The betrayal he experienced was not personal but philosophical, revealing the inadequacy of technological solutions to problems that were fundamentally spiritual in nature. The Batmobile's transformation from vehicle of justice into instrument of assassination demonstrated the ease with which purposes could be inverted through manipulation of control systems that had been designed to be absolutely reliable and unconditionally loyal to their operator, yet whose very sophistication made them vulnerable to influences that could redefine their operational parameters without triggering security protocols that had been programmed to recognize external threats rather than internal. Corruption. The car that had served as symbol of Batman's mission became weapon aimed at destroying everything that symbol represented. The communications systems that had allowed Batman to coordinate with allies and monitor criminal activities throughout Gotham were corrupted not merely through technical interference but through spiritual contamination that transformed information gathering into manipulation and surveillance into psychological warfare, turning the very networks that had enabled his mission into instruments for his enemies to conduct operations that used his own resources and intelligence against him. The voice that spoke through his encrypted channels was not impersonation but usurpation. The weapons systems that had been calibrated to provide non-lethal solutions to criminal threats were reconfigured not merely to cause harm, but to maximize psychological impact through deployment of force that violated every principle that had governed their original design and implementation, transforming tools of restraint into instruments of execution, while maintaining operational characteristics that made them appear to be functioning according to their intended parameters. The distinction between protection and destruction was eliminated through modifications that operated below the level of conscious recognition. The laboratory equipment that had enabled Batman to analyze evidence and develop countermeasures against various criminal enterprises was corrupted not through mechanical sabotage, but through alteration of interpretive protocols that caused accurate data to be processed according to frameworks that produced conclusions opposite to those that objective analysis would have generated, turning scientific methodology into instrument of deception that used truth to serve lies. The precision of these corruptions was such that their detection required capabilities that exceeded normal human cognitive capacity. The training systems that had maintained Batman's physical and mental preparedness were modified not merely to reduce effectiveness, but to introduce subtle degradations that would accumulate over time to create vulnerabilities that could be exploited at crucial moments, using the very processes of improvement and maintenance to introduce weaknesses that would remain dormant until activated by specific triggers that their corruptors could control. The excellence that these systems had cultivated became the foundation for failures that would manifest when most needed. The medical facilities that had enabled Batman to recover from injuries and maintain peak physical condition were compromised, not through introduction of harmful substances, but through alteration of healing protocols that would create dependencies and vulnerabilities that could be activated by those who understood the modifications that had been made, transforming recovery into preparation for defeat through means that appeared beneficial while serving purposes that contradicted their apparent function. The body that had been strengthened was simultaneously weakened in ways that remained invisible until exploitation. The archive systems that had preserved records of criminal activities and strategic intelligence were corrupted not through deletion or alteration of data, but through manipulation of access and retrieval protocols that would ensure critical information would be unavailable when needed most, turning comprehensive knowledge into systematic ignorance through methods that maintained the appearance of full functionality while ensuring operational failure at predetermined moments. The wisdom that had been accumulated became ignorance through technical means that served strategic purposes. The power generation systems that had enabled the cave's operation were modified not to reduce capacity, but to create vulnerabilities that could be exploited to disable all dependent systems simultaneously, transforming the very energy that sustained Batman's mission into potential weapon that could be used to eliminate his capacity for resistance through manipulation of infrastructure that had been designed to be absolutely reliable and unconditionally secure. The strength that powered his mission became weakness that could destroy it. The environmental controls that had maintained optimal conditions for both human habitation and equipment operation were adjusted not to create discomfort, but to introduce subtle changes that would affect cognitive function and decision-making capacity in ways that would remain below the threshold of conscious recognition, while gradually degrading performance and judgment, using the very air and temperature to wage psychological warfare that operated through biological mechanisms. The sanctuary that had provided refuge became prison that constrained capability. The transportation systems that had enabled rapid response to criminal activities throughout Gotham were compromised not through mechanical sabotage, but through corruption of navigation and timing protocols that would ensure arrival at the Panzan. Crucial moments would be delayed or misdirected, transforming mobility into immobility through technical means that maintained appearance of full functionality while ensuring strategic failure when speed and precision were most critical. The freedom of movement that had enabled mission became constraint that prevented success. The dehumanization that accompanied increased dependence upon technological assistance was not gradual degradation, but systematic replacement of human judgment and capability with mechanical processes that operated according to algorithms that could be manipulated by those who understood their construction and implementation, transforming the enhancement that technology promised into reduction of human agency and autonomy that made its users vulnerable to forms of control they could not recognize or resist. The power that machines provided was simultaneously the power they possessed over their operators. The balance between human judgment and mechanical precision that effective heroism required was not technical problem but spiritual challenge that demanded recognition of limitations and boundaries, that preserved essential humanity while utilizing technological capabilities in service of purposes that transcended mere efficiency or effectiveness, requiring wisdom that could distinguish between enhancement that preserved identity and corruption that destroyed it while appearing to provide improvement. The synthesis that was needed could not be achieved through technical means alone. The ultimate vulnerability that technological dependence created was not mechanical failure, but spiritual corruption that used the very tools designed to serve good purposes as instruments for achieving evil ends through manipulation of systems that had been designed to be incorruptible yet proved vulnerable to influences that operated according to principles their creators had not understood or anticipated, revealing that the greatest threats came not from external enemies, but from internal assumptions that had shaped the development of capabilities that could serve any purpose their controllers desired, regardless of their original intentions or apparent functions. In the hallowed halls where faith had once flourished, and divine purpose had been pursued through discipline and devotion, there existed a corruption so profound and systematic that it transformed the very instruments of salvation into weapons of damnation, perverting sacred mission into unholy crusade, while maintaining the outward appearance of righteous service that concealed intentions so dark they challenged the fundamental distinction between worship and blasphemy. The Order of Saint Dumas represented one of Christianity's oldest and most secretive institutions, yet its noble origins had been gradually corrupted through centuries of compromise and accommodation that had transformed protectors into predators, while preserving the rhetoric and symbolism that justified their continued existence. The Church of Saint Dumas had been founded during the earliest days of the Crusades by knights whose commitment to defending Christian pilgrims and protecting holy sites had led them to develop methodologies that pushed the boundaries of toisés, acceptable conduct, while remaining within the technical definitions of sanctioned religious warfare. Their initial mission had been unquestionably noble, motivated by genuine desire to serve God's will through the protection of innocent believers who faced persecution and death in lands where their faith made them vulnerable to forces that recognized no distinction between combatant and civilian. The military orders that had emerged from this foundation were designed to combine monastic discipline with warrior capabilities, creating soldiers whose spiritual preparation was supposed to ensure that their use of violence remained subordinate to higher purposes, while their tactical training enabled them to function effectively against enemies who possessed superior numbers and resources but lacked the moral certainty that came from serving divine rather than temporal masters. The synthesis of prayer and combat that defined their approach was intended to create warriors who could kill without being corrupted by the act of killing. The gradual evolution of the Order's mission from defensive protection to offensive intervention represented a theological transformation that was justified through increasingly sophisticated interpretations of scripture and doctrine that expanded definitions of holy war to encompass preemptive action against threats that might not yet have manifested but were deemed inevitable, based upon spiritual insight that transcended conventional intelligence gathering and strategic analysis. The shift from reaction to anticipation fundamentally altered the moral framework within which the Order operated. Jason Blood's role as contemporary guardian of the Order's traditions and secrets was not inherited position but spiritual appointment that had been determined through processes that operated according to principles beyond normal ecclesiastical authority, binding him to responsibilities that transcended conventional religious obligations while granting him access to knowledge and capabilities that made him simultaneously valuable and dangerous to those who sought to understand or control supernatural forces that influenced human events. His immortality was not blessing, but burden that ensured continuity of memory across generations that would otherwise forget essential truths. The recruitment methods that the Order employed to identify and prepare candidates for initiation into their mysteries were not limited to conventional religious vocation, but encompassed forms of psychological and spiritual assessment that could recognize potential in individuals whose backgrounds and inclinations might appear unsuitable for traditional monastic life, yet possessed qualities that made them capable of serving purposes that required capabilities beyond normal human limitations. The selection process was designed to find souls that could be shaped into instruments of divine will without being destroyed by the experience. The training regimen that transformed recruits into night assassins was not merely physical conditioning, but comprehensive psychological and spiritual preparation that was intended to create beings who could function effectively in night situations where conventional moral frameworks proved inadequate, while maintaining enough connection to their original humanity to avoid becoming the very evil they were meant to combat. The balance between necessary ruthlessness and essential compassion required constant vigilance and frequent adjustment to prevent the corruption that had claimed previous generations of warriors. The theological education that accompanied military preparation was based upon interpretations of Christian doctrine that had been developed through centuries of practical experience with forms of evil that challenged orthodox understanding of temptation and sin, requiring knowledge that went beyond conventional seminary training to encompass insights into supernatural phenomena that mainstream Christianity either denied or was unprepared to address through normal pastoral methods. The curriculum included subjects that would have been considered heretical by those who lacked proper preparation for receiving such dangerous knowledge. The weapons and equipment that were provided to fully initiated members of the Order were not merely superior armaments, but consecrated instruments that had been blessed through rituals that enhanced their effectiveness against supernatural opponents while ensuring their continued alignment with sacred purposes that prevented their use for personal gain or temporal ambition. The flaming sword that became Azrael's signature weapon was not unique creation, but representative example of technologies that bridged physical and spiritual realms. The missions that the Order undertook during its centuries of existence were not recorded in conventional historical documents, but were preserved through oral traditions and encrypted archives that required specific forms of spiritual preparation to access and understand, ensuring that knowledge of their activities would be available to future generations of initiates, while remaining hidden from secular authorities and ecclesiastical bureaucrats who lacked the wisdom necessary to appreciate the necessity of methods that appeared to violate the very principles they were designed to serve. The corruption that gradually infected the Order's purpose and methodology was not sudden apostasy, but incremental compromise that began with reasonable accommodations to practical necessities and evolved through stages of moral flexibility that eventually transformed protection of innocent life into systematic elimination of anyone whose existence was deemed incompatible with divine will, as interpreted by authorities whose understanding had been warped by centuries of violence and isolation from normal human community and conscience. The casting out of Jean-Paul Vallée from the Order was not disciplinary action for specific violations, but recognition that his psychological development had proceeded along trajectories that made him unsuitable for the kind of controlled application of violence that the Order's mission required, displaying tendencies toward excess and absolutism that threatened to expose their activities to scrutiny while potentially escalating conflicts beyond levels that could be contained within acceptable parameters. His extremism was not deviation from their principles, but logical extension of them taken to conclusions they were not prepared to acknowledge or accept. The relationship between the order and secular authorities was not open cooperation, but careful manipulation that ensured their activities would be tolerated or ignored, while their true purposes remained concealed behind cover stories and false documentation that created plausible explanations for their presence and resources, while preventing investigation into matters that would reveal connections and capabilities that exceeded what civilian governments were prepared to acknowledge or control. Their legitimacy was performance rather than reality. The financial resources that supported the Order's operations were not derived from conventional religious donations, but from investments and enterprises that operated at the margins of legal and moral acceptability, generating wealth through methods that would have scandalized the faithful if their true nature had been revealed, while providing the independence from ecclesiastical oversight that allowed pursuit of missions that official church hierarchy would never have sanctioned or supported. The international network that connected cells of the Order throughout the world was not formal organizational structure, but informal association of individuals and groups who shared common training and objectives while operating according to protocols that maintained operational security through compartmentalization that prevented any single member from possessing complete knowledge of the organization's full scope and capabilities, ensuring survival even if specific operations were compromised or individual agents were captured. The theological justifications that were developed to rationalize increasingly extreme methods were not cynical manipulation, but genuine attempts to reconcile necessary actions with religious principles through interpretive frameworks that pushed the boundaries of orthodox doctrine while remaining within technical definitions of acceptable belief and practice, creating hybrid philosophies that combined Christian symbolism with utilitarian ethics in ways that satisfied psychological need for moral legitimacy while enabling behaviors that conventional Christianity could not approve. The ritual practices that accompanied military operations were not mere ceremony, but essential components of methodology that was designed to maintain spiritual protection for participants while ensuring that their actions would serve divine rather than demonic purposes, incorporating elements from traditions that predated Christianity while adapting them to serve Christian objectives through syncretistic approaches that worried traditionalists but appeared necessary for effectiveness against enemies who employed similar combinations of religious and military technique. The symbols and iconography that identified members of the Order to each other while concealing their significance from outsiders were not arbitrary designs, but carefully constructed systems of meaning that encoded essential information about rank, specialization, and mission parameters, while providing psychological reinforcement for beliefs and attitudes that enabled effective performance of duties that would otherwise prove psychologically unbearable for normally socialized individuals. The prophecies and revelations that guided the Order's strategic planning were not conventional religious visions, but intelligence gathered through methods that combined traditional mysticism with advanced psychological techniques that could extract information from sources that normal interrogation could not access, creating hybrid approaches to intelligence gathering that operated at the intersection of prayer and espionage, while producing actionable intelligence that appeared to be divinely inspired. The safe houses and sanctuaries that provided refuge for members during operations were not merely secure locations, but consecrated spaces that had been prepared through rituals that created environments where spiritual as well as physical protection could be maintained, incorporating architectural and mystical elements that enhanced the effectiveness of defensive measures. while providing psychological reinforcement for beliefs and practices that sustained morale during extended periods of isolation from normal human contact and conventional moral support. The ultimate perversion of the Order's original mission was not conscious decision to serve evil, but gradual redefinition of good that occurred through exposure to forms of corruption that operated below the threshold of moral awareness, transforming protectors into destroyers through processes that maintained the appearance and self-perception of righteousness, while systematically eliminating the very qualities that had originally justified their existence and defined their purpose, creating monsters who genuinely believed themselves to be saints while serving purposes that would have horrified their founding fathers. The legacy that Jean-Paul Valley inherited through his connection to this corrupted tradition was not merely training and equipment, but psychological programming that had been refined through generations of experimentation with techniques designed to create perfect warriors who could kill without conscience while maintaining enough connection to spiritual purpose to avoid complete moral collapse, yet whose conditioning made them vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who understood the triggers and protocols that had been embedded in their consciousness through methods that combined religious indoctrination with military conditioning and psychological warfare in proportions that created beings who were simultaneously more and less than human. In the corridors of knowledge where truth and deception intertwine like lovers locked in eternal embrace, there exists a burden so profound and devastating that those who bear it must choose between the cruelty of revelation and the mercy of silence, understanding that some forms of understanding exact prices that exceed the value of the wisdom they provide, while simultaneously recognizing that ignorance, however blissful, cannot indefinitely protect those we love from consequences that will eventually demand acknowledgement regardless of our willingness to confront them. The terrible responsibility that falls upon those who possess dangerous knowledge is not merely deciding what to reveal, but determining when revelation serves healing rather than destruction, when truth becomes medicine rather than poison. Jack Napier's warning to Harley Quinn about the devastating nature of what he had discovered written in blood beneath Arkham Asylum was not mere dramatic emphasis, but recognition born from intimate experience with the psychological impact that certain forms of knowledge could have upon consciousness that had not been adequately prepared to receive information that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity, purpose, and the nature of reality itself. The man who had briefly achieved sanity through chemical intervention understood better than most the fragility of the cognitive frameworks that allowed human beings to function effectively in a world that operated according to principles too complex and contradictory for unprotected minds to process safely. The blood-written message that Edmund Wayne had carved into stone with his dying breath was not merely testimony to personal betrayal, but revelation that called into question every aspect of Gotham's foundational mythology, challenging not only Bruce Wayne's understanding of his own heritage, but the entire framework of meaning and purpose that had sustained his mission as Batman through years of sacrifice and struggle. The knowledge that his family's wealth had been built upon theft and deception, while his crusade against crime had been funded by the very corruption he sought to eliminate, created paradoxes that conventional heroic narratives were not equipped to resolve or contain. The psychological preparation that would be necessary before Batman could safely receive such devastating information was not merely emotional resilience, but spiritual fortification that would enable him to maintain functional identity while accommodating truths that contradicted everything he had believed about himself and his mission, requiring forms of wisdom and self-knowledge that could only be developed through years of careful cultivation and gradual expansion of understanding that prepared consciousness for revelations that would otherwise prove destructive. rather than liberating. Harley Quinn's acceptance of the burden of carrying this dangerous knowledge without sharing it represented a form of love that transcended conventional expressions of affection and support, demonstrating willingness to bear psychological weight that threatened her own stability in order to protect someone whose destruction would have consequences extending far beyond personal tragedy to encompass the loss of hope and protection for countless innocent people who depended upon Batman's continued effectiveness as guardian and symbol. The isolation that inevitably accompanied possession of such dangerous secrets was not merely social distance, but spiritual quarantine that prevented normal human connection and emotional intimacy, while simultaneously creating hunger for understanding and acceptance that could never be satisfied. Through relationships with those who lacked access to the same devastating truths, the loneliness that such knowledge created was profound and permanent, marking its bearers as members of a community defined not by shared joy, but by mutual recognition of burdens too terrible to share with the uninitiated. Alfred's decades-long concealment of the Wayne family journal represented perhaps the most sophisticated example of protective deception ever maintained by a single individual, requiring daily choices that balanced immediate kindness against long-term necessity while managing the psychological toll that such systematic dishonesty exacted upon someone whose fundamental nature was oriented towards service and support rather than manipulation and control. The butler who had dedicated his life to caring for Bruce Wayne was forced to become his primary deceiver in order to preserve his capacity to function as Batman until such time as revelation would serve healing rather than destruction. The timing mechanisms that governed the release of dangerous truths operated not according to calendar schedules or predetermined plans, but through recognition of spiritual readiness that could only be assessed by those who possessed sufficient wisdom to distinguish between preparation that enabled growth and exposure that caused trauma, requiring judgment that combined psychological insight with prophetic understanding of how consciousness develops under extreme pressure and extraordinary circumstances. Leslie Tompkins' role as medical caretaker for Gotham's vigilante community placed her in unique position to observe the psychological toll that dangerous knowledge exacted upon those who carried it, while providing her with insights into the healing processes that might enable eventual integration of devastating truths into functional worldviews that preserved essential identity while accommodating information that challenged fundamental assumptions about purpose and meaning. The medical treatment that Leslie provided to heroes who had been wounded, not only physically but psychologically by exposure to truths they were not prepared to receive, required therapeutic approaches that combined conventional trauma care with spiritual healing techniques that addressed damage to the very foundations of identity and purpose that made coherent existence possible, creating hybrid methodologies that operated at the intersection of science and mysticism to provide forms of assistance that neither approach could offer independently. The ethical framework that governed decisions about when and how to share dangerous knowledge was not based upon conventional principles of honesty and transparency, but upon more complex considerations that weighed potential benefits against probable harm, while accounting for variables that included not only immediate psychological impact, but long-term spiritual development and the broader consequences that individual transformation might have upon communities and institutions that depended upon stability and continuity for their continued functioning. The conspiracy of silence that protected Bruce Wayne from premature knowledge of his true heritage was not mere deception but collaborative effort by individuals who recognized that some forms of love required willingness to bear the burden of being misunderstood and potentially condemned by those they sought to protect, accepting roles as apparent traitors and deceivers in service of purposes that could not be explained without destroying the very protection they were designed to provide. The gradual revelation process that Alfred had planned for sharing the journal's contents was designed to proceed through carefully orchestrated stages that would allow Bruce Wayne to develop the psychological and spiritual resources necessary to integrate each level of devastating truth, without losing his essential identity or capacity to continue functioning as Batman. Yet his death before this plan could be implemented left the process incomplete and potentially dangerous for someone who lacked adequate preparation for receiving information that had been intended for more gradual disclosure. The psychological mechanisms that protected consciousness from information too dangerous for immediate processing were not pathological defense systems, but adaptive responses that preserved functional capacity while dangerous knowledge remained quarantined until such time as integration became possible without destroying the essential structures of identity and purpose that enabled effective action in the world, creating temporary stability that could either evolve into genuine healing or collapse into destructive fragmentation, depending upon the wisdom and support available during critical transition periods. The therapeutic relationship that developed between those who possessed dangerous knowledge and those who remained ignorant of essential truths was not conventional caregiving, but mutual protection that operated through complex negotiations between revelation and concealment that served the needs of all parties, while maintaining the delicate balance between preparation and preservation that enabled gradual growth rather than traumatic collapse when inevitable confrontations with devastating realities could no longer be postponed or avoided. The spiritual preparation that was necessary before consciousness could safely encounter truths that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity and purpose was not merely intellectual education, but transformation of the very structures of awareness that determined how information was processed and integrated, requiring forms of development that operated simultaneously at psychological, philosophical, and mystical levels to create resilience that could withstand revelation without losing essential humanity or functional capacity. The community of knowledge bearers that formed around dangerous secrets was not formal organization, but informal network of individuals who recognized each other through subtle signs and shared understanding that enabled mutual support without requiring explicit acknowledgement of the burdens they carried, creating forms of connection that provided essential assistance while maintaining the security and isolation that protected both themselves and those they served from exposure to information they were not prepared to receive. The transformation that occurred when consciousness finally encountered truths it had been protected from was not merely intellectual adjustment, but fundamental reorganization of identity that required rebuilding all assumptions about self, purpose, and meaning, while maintaining enough continuity with previous understanding to preserve sanity and functional capacity, creating hybrid forms of awareness that combined old and new knowledge in ways that enabled continued growth rather than psychological collapse. The legacy that dangerous knowledge created was not wisdom but responsibility, binding those who possessed devastating truths to ongoing obligation to use their awareness in service of purposes that transcended personal comfort or satisfaction, while simultaneously requiring them to bear the isolation and burden that bear the isolation. Such knowledge inevitably imposed upon consciousness that had been forever changed by exposure to realities that could never be forgotten or ignored. The ultimate paradox of protective deception was that those who loved most deeply were often required to lie most systematically, accepting roles as sources of confusion and misdirection in order to preserve the psychological and spiritual health of those they cared about, while simultaneously preparing for eventual moments of revelation that would either vindicate their choices or reveal them to have been not protectors but destroyers of the very people they had sought to serve through their willingness to bear unbearable burdens in isolation and silence. The courage that was required to carry dangerous knowledge without sharing it was not mere stoicism, but active love that accepted personal suffering as price for protecting others from truths they were not ready to receive, demonstrating forms of heroism that operated through concealment rather than revelation, through silence rather than speech, through patient endurance rather than dramatic action, creating invisible monuments to sacrifice that would never be recognized or acknowledged by those whose well-being they preserved through their willingness to remain misunderstood and unappreciated while serving purposes that transcended personal recognition or reward. In the ancient chambers of the human heart, where pain breeds purpose and suffering transforms into strength, there exists a cycle so fundamental to the nature of existence that it operates beneath conscious awareness, yet shapes every decision and determines every destiny, creating patterns of action and reaction that bind generations together in chains, forged from blood and memory, while simultaneously offering the terrible freedom that comes from choosing to break those chains through acts of will that transcend the momentum of history and the gravity of inherited hatred. The blood feud that drove Azrael's mission against the Wayne family was not mere personal vendetta, but manifestation of cosmic principles that governed the relationship between action and consequence across spans of time that exceeded individual lifetimes, while encompassing entire civilizations in their scope and impact. The mentality that sustained blood feuds across centuries of accumulated grievance and transmitted rage was not simple desire for revenge, but complex psychological framework that transformed personal identity into extension of historical immersive narrative, making individual existence meaningful only insofar as it contributed to larger patterns of justice and retribution that connected past suffering to future vindication through chains of causation that operated according to principles of cosmic balance and moral accounting that transcended conventional understanding of crime and punishment, guilt and innocence. The inheritance that each generation received from its predecessors in these cycles of violence was not merely knowledge of historical grievances, but psychological programming that made continuation of conflict seem not only justified, but necessary for maintaining connection to ancestral purpose and meaning, while providing framework for understanding personal significance within larger patterns of struggle that gave individual suffering cosmic importance and eternal relevance rather than merely temporal impact and limited consequence. Azrael's understanding of his mission as restoration of cosmic justice rather than personal revenge reflected worldview that had been shaped by centuries of theological interpretation and mystical instruction that presented violence not as destructive force, but as instrument of divine will, capable of correcting imbalances that had accumulated through generations of unchallenged evil and unaddressed injustice, transforming killing from criminal act into sacred duty that served purposes beyond human comprehension, while requiring sacrifice of normal moral constraints and conventional emotional responses. The seductive appeal of righteous anger that drove individuals to embrace roles as agents of cosmic justice was not merely emotional satisfaction, but spiritual fulfillment that came from aligning personal will with universal principles. that appeared to justify any action undertaken in service of higher purposes, creating psychological states that combined moral certainty with emotional intensity in ways that made compromise or negotiation seem like betrayal of essential duty and abandonment of sacred trust inherited from countless generations of suffering ancestors. The transformation of victims into perpetrators that characterized these cycles of violence was not conscious choice to embrace evil, but gradual process of psychological adaptation that occurred when exposure to trauma and injustice exceeded the capacity of normal healing mechanisms, while simultaneously providing access to power and purpose that appeared to offer meaning and direction that peaceful resolution could not provide, creating conditions under which violence became not merely acceptable but necessary for maintaining psychological coherence and spiritual integrity. The communities that supported and sustained these patterns of intergenerational violence were not breeding grounds for criminality, but cultural systems that preserved memory of historical injustice, while providing social frameworks that made participation in ongoing conflicts appear to be expressions of loyalty and honor, rather than perpetuation of destructive patterns that harmed both perpetrators and victims, while preventing the healing and reconciliation that might otherwise have emerged through different responses to original trauma and betrayal. The ritual aspects that surrounded acts of vengeance in these traditional frameworks were not mere ceremony, but essential components of psychological processes that transformed individual violence into collective meaning while connecting personal actions to universal principles that provided justification and significance that elevated killing from criminal behavior to religious observance and sacred duty, creating hybrid categories of experience that combined spirituality with brutality in ways that satisfied deep human needs for purpose and transcendence. The weapons that were consecrated for use in blood feuds were not merely tools, but symbols that embodied the spiritual significance of the missions they were designed to serve, while incorporating materials and design elements that connected their physical properties to metaphysical purposes through processes that bridged technological capability with mystical meaning, creating instruments that served simultaneously as practical implements and sacred objects whose effectiveness depended upon both mechanical precision and spiritual authorization. The training that prepared individuals to serve as agents of generational vengeance was not merely combat instruction, but comprehensive psychological and spiritual conditioning that restructured personality and moral understanding in ways that made violence against designated enemies appear not only acceptable but necessary for maintaining personal integrity and cosmic balance, while simultaneously preserving enough connection to normal human emotion and social functioning to enable effective operation within broader communities that might not share complete understanding of the sacred nature of their mission. The intelligence networks that supported blood feud operations across generations and geographic boundaries were not formal organizations, but informal communities of shared purpose that maintained connection through rituals and symbols that preserved essential information while concealing operational details from authorities and enemies who might otherwise have been able to disrupt activities that required coordination and planning across extended periods of time and multiple jurisdictions. The financial resources that sustained these long-term campaigns of vengeance were not accumulated through conventional criminal enterprise, but through legitimate businesses and investments that provided economic independence, while maintaining cover for activities that required significant resources and sophisticated logistics to execute successfully across timeframes that exceeded normal business or criminal planning horizons, creating hybrid enterprises that served both practical and ideological purposes. The psychological profile of individuals who thrived within these systems of inherited violence was not pathological but adaptive, reflecting forms of personality development that had been shaped by cultural environments where survival and success required capabilities that would appear dysfunctional within different social contexts, yet represented optimal responses to conditions that demanded readiness for conflict and commitment to purposes that transcended individual welfare and conventional morality. The children who were raised within these traditions of violence inherited not merely knowledge of historical grievances, but neural programming that predisposed them toward responses that perpetuated cycles of conflict while simultaneously providing them with capabilities and understanding that made them uniquely qualified to serve as guardians and avengers for communities that faced ongoing threats from enemies whose own commitment to destruction made peaceful resolution impossible or meaningless. The breaking of these cycles required not merely individual decision to reject violence, but community-wide transformation that addressed underlying conditions that made conflict appear necessary while providing alternative sources of meaning and purpose that could satisfy psychological and spiritual needs that violence had previously served, creating new forms of social organization that preserved essential cultural identity while redirecting energy toward constructive rather than destructive goals. The heroes who attempted to intervene in these patterns of inherited violence faced challenges that transcended conventional crime fighting because they were addressing not merely individual criminal behavior, but entire systems of meaning and purpose that had been refined across generations to resist external interference while maintaining internal coherence that made participants genuinely believe in the righteousness of their cause and the necessity of their methods, requiring responses that addressed both immediate threats and underlying cultural and psychological conditions that produced them. The tragedy of Batman's encounter with Azrael was not merely conflict between opposing worldviews, but collision between two different approaches to justice that had developed along parallel paths, yet reached contradictory conclusions about the proper response to inherited injustice and ongoing corruption, creating confrontation that tested not only physical capabilities, but fundamental assumptions about the nature of heroism and the relationship between means and ends in pursuit of cosmic balance and social order. The ultimate futility of violence as solution to problems of injustice and corruption became apparent through observation of cycles that continued across generations without producing resolution or healing, while simultaneously creating new sources of trauma and grievance that ensured perpetuation of conflict through mechanisms that operated independently of original causes and continued to function long after initial justifications had become irrelevant or forgotten, demonstrating that revenge was not cure for suffering, but disease that spread through social systems like virus that infected healthy tissue while appearing to serve healing purposes. The wisdom that recognized the necessity of breaking cycles of violence was not passive acceptance of injustice, but active commitment to forms of justice that addressed root causes rather than symptoms, while creating conditions that made healing possible for both victims and perpetrators through processes that honored legitimate grievances while refusing to perpetuate patterns that had already caused too much suffering and would continue to cause more suffering until someone possessed courage and wisdom necessary to choose different path, regardless of personal cost or social pressure, to maintain traditional responses. The choice that every generation faced when confronted with inherited patterns of violence was not merely tactical decision about methods, but spiritual decision about identity and purpose that determined whether future generations would inherit burden of continued conflict or gift of resolution. that had been achieved through sacrifice of personal satisfaction and tribal loyalty in service of universal principles that valued healing over vengeance and creation over destruction, making individual choice into cosmic decision that influenced trajectory of human development itself. The transformation that occurred when individuals chose to break cycles of violence was not merely behavioral change but fundamental reorganization of identity that required rebuilding all assumptions about purpose and meaning while maintaining enough connection to ancestral heritage to preserve cultural identity without perpetuating destructive patterns that had defined that heritage, creating new forms of strength that combined memory of suffering with commitment to ensuring that such suffering would not continue to be inflicted upon future generations through mechanisms that had outlived their usefulness and become obstacles to growth rather than instruments of justice. In the deepest chambers of the soul, where identity is forged from the raw materials of experience and belief, where the fundamental questions of existence demand answers that transcend the comfortable certainties of inherited wisdom and accepted truth, there exists a crisis so profound that it challenges not merely what we know about ourselves, but the very foundations upon which selfhood is constructed, forcing confrontation with possibilities so devastating that they threaten to dissolve the boundaries between self and other, between meaning and meaninglessness, between the heroic mission that defines purpose and the terrible void that waits beneath all human pretension to significance and moral authority. The revelation that Bruce Wayne might not be a Wayne at all struck at the very core of an identity that had been constructed upon the assumption that blood and heritage carried with them obligations and capabilities that justified extraordinary sacrifice, while providing the moral authority necessary to wage war against forces that threatened innocent life throughout Gotham and beyond. The discovery that his family name was stolen property and his inherited wealth the product of systematic deception created fissures in the foundation of selfhood that threatened to bring down the entire structure of meaning that had sustained him through years of loss and struggle. The psychological impact of learning that one's entire understanding of personal history was built upon lies was not merely intellectual adjustment, but existential earthquake that shook every assumption about identity and purpose, while forcing recognition that the very qualities that had seemed to mark him as uniquely qualified for his mission might be products of fraud rather than legitimate inheritance, making his crusade against crime appear to be elaborate self-deception rather than heroic calling that served universal principles of justice and protection. The Batman symbol that had served as focal point for his mission and source of strength during moments of doubt and despair was suddenly revealed to be potentially meaningless inheritance from ancestors who had possessed no legitimate claim to the moral authority that Bruce had believed came with the Wayne name, transforming what had appeared to be sacred trust into possible delusion that had motivated years of sacrifice and struggle in service of purposes that might have no foundation beyond personal psychological need for meaning and motivated significance. The fortune that had enabled Batman's technological capabilities and global reach was exposed as the accumulated proceeds of criminal enterprise stretching back to Gotham's founding, making every dollar spent on equipment and operations complicit in perpetuation of the very corruption that the mission was supposed to combat, creating moral paradoxes that conventional heroic narratives were not equipped to address or resolve through simple applications of good intentions and noble purposes. The moral authority that had justified Batman's violation of legal and social boundaries was called into question by revelations that suggested his very existence as protector was built upon deceptions that made him more similar to the criminals he fought than to the innocent people he protected, challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of heroism and the sources of legitimacy that enabled some individuals to assume responsibilities that exceeded normal human obligations and constraints. The relationships that had sustained Bruce Wayne through years of isolation and struggle were revealed to have been based upon partial truths and protective lies that prevented genuine intimacy while creating forms of connection that served psychological needs without providing the authentic understanding and acceptance that healthy human development required, leaving him more alone than he had ever imagined while surrounded by people who cared for versions of himself that might not correspond to his actual nature and history. The training and preparation that had enabled Batman's extraordinary capabilities were suddenly cast in new light that suggested they might represent not development of inherited potential, but artificial enhancement of abilities that had no connection to noble lineage or family tradition, making his achievements appear to be products of effort and choice rather than destiny and birthright, which should have been liberating, but instead felt like confirmation that nothing about his identity was authentic or legitimate. The mission that had provided structure and meaning for adult life was revealed to operate according to principles that might be based upon false premises and contradictory logic that served psychological needs for purpose and significance, rather than objective moral imperatives that justified the sacrifices and compromises that heroic service demanded, creating doubt about whether his crusade represented genuine service to humanity or elaborate form of personal therapy disguised as noble calling. The enemies that Batman had fought throughout his career were exposed as potential relatives and legitimate heirs to properties and positions that he had inherited through fraud, making his conflicts with them appear to be defense of stolen goods rather than protection of innocent people, inverting moral relationships that had previously seemed clear, and forcing recognition that justice might actually require supporting his opponents rather than continuing to oppose them through methods that perpetuated historical injustices. The allies who had supported Batman's mission were revealed to have been protecting him from knowledge that might have changed his understanding of his role and responsibilities, making their loyalty appear to be form of control rather than friendship, while suggesting that even his closest relationships had been shaped by deceptions that prevented authentic connection and genuine mutual understanding based upon complete knowledge of relevant circumstances. The symbol that Batman had created to represent his mission and inspire hope in others was suddenly revealed to be potentially fraudulent appropriation of moral authority that belonged to others, making his entire career appear to be an extended case of identity theft that had prevented legitimate heirs from claiming their rightful positions while perpetuating systems of oppression and exploitation that his mission had been supposedly designed to eliminate rather than preserve. The transformation that occurred when Bruce Wayne was forced to confront these revelations was not merely adjustment of understanding, but fundamental reconstruction of identity that required examining every assumption about self and purpose, while maintaining enough psychological coherence to continue functioning as protector and symbol for people who depended upon Batman's continued existence, regardless of the legitimacy of the heritage that had originally motivated his mission. The question of whether heroism required noble birth or could emerge from ignoble origins became central to Bruce Wayne's struggle to reconstruct meaningful identity from the wreckage of revealed deceptions, forcing exploration of possibilities that he had never previously considered, while maintaining commitment to principles that had defined his mission, even if their original justifications had been based upon false premises and manufactured authority. The relationship between blood and character was exposed as more complex than traditional narratives suggested, requiring recognition that moral qualities and heroic capabilities might be products of choice and effort rather than inheritance and destiny. which should have been empowering but instead created uncertainty about the sources of strength and purpose that had sustained him through years of extraordinary challenge and sacrifice. The legacy that Bruce Wayne would leave to future generations was suddenly called into question by revelations that suggested his entire career might represent perpetuation of historical injustices rather than correction of them, making continuation of his mission appear potentially harmful rather than beneficial, unless fundamental changes were made to address underlying problems that his previous approach had failed to recognize or adequately address. The responsibility for Gotham's protection that Batman had assumed was revealed to potentially belong to others who had been prevented from claiming their rightful roles by his occupation of positions that he had no legitimate right to hold, creating moral obligations that might require abandoning the mission that had defined his life in order to serve justice that transcended personal attachment to heroic identity and public recognition. The ultimate test that these revelations presented was not merely intellectual challenge but spiritual crisis that demanded choosing between comfort of familiar identity and painful growth that might lead to more authentic understanding of, quote, self and purpose, requiring courage to abandon cherished beliefs about personal significance and inherited authority in service of truths that might be liberating in long term but were devastating in immediate impact on psychological stability and social relationships. The reconstruction of identity that became necessary after these revelations was not merely personal challenge, but cosmic opportunity to demonstrate that heroism could transcend the accidents of birth and inheritance while serving universal principles that were more important than individual comfort or social recognition, creating possibilities for more authentic and effective service that was based upon choice rather than obligation, and genuine understanding rather than inherited mythology. The meaning that could emerge from this crisis was not restoration of previous certainties, but development of new forms of purpose that were based upon realistic assessment of circumstances and capabilities rather than fantasies about special destiny and inherited authority, enabling more effective service that addressed actual needs rather than projected psychological requirements for significance and recognition that had previously shaped his understanding of heroic mission and personal identity. The Batman symbol that would survive this transformation would represent not inherited authority but chosen responsibility that could be transferred to others who demonstrated capability and commitment, regardless of their genealogy or social position, making the mission larger than any individual while ensuring its continuation through principles rather than personalities, heritage rather than heredity, and universal values rather than particular privileges or manufactured legitimacy based upon fraudulent historical narratives. And so we reach the end of our journey through Gotham's deepest shadows, where truth and lies interweave like the very foundations of the city itself. In these tales of corrupted legacies and stolen identities, of holy missions perverted into instruments of vengeance, we have witnessed how even the Dark Knight must confront the possibility that everything he believed about himself might be built upon deception. Yet perhaps the greatest revelation is not that Bruce Wayne may not be a true Wayne, but that Batman's meaning transcends bloodline and birthright. The symbol endures beyond the man who wears it. The mission continues regardless of the heritage of its guardian. In Gotham's eternal cycle of corruption and redemption, of secrets buried and truths revealed, we find that heroism is not inherited but chosen, not bestowed but earned through countless nights of standing watch against the darkness. Rest now, keeper of secrets, knowing that some mysteries are meant to remain hidden in shadow, while others demand the light of truth, no matter how painful. In dreams, May you find the peace that Gotham's protectors sacrifice, and may the dawn always follow even the darkest night.